What's going on, YouTube? This is Regal here with Liberty Forge. Forge of Liberty. How's everybody doing? Thank you so much for being here. I'm doing pretty great. It's about 10:42 my time here in Florida, and it's freezing. You see, I got my coat on, so so that says anything. It's 55 degrees according to my computer. It feels more like 45 degrees because the humidity here is still like 95%. So imagine that. I'm really excited about today's stream. This is a topic that I'm very, very passionate about. And I have a like-minded friend here that I'm going to introduce here in a second that I know is going to make for a great conversation. So hit the like, hit the sub, support the channel. Thank you so much again for being here. Anybody who wants to be part of this conversation here on the air, please email me, forgingliberty@gmail.com. And, we'll do a little bit of a screen, see what we want to talk about, and we'll get it scheduled in. I'd love to have you on board and have civil discussions with reasonable people. And I think that's the work that we have to do to spread these ideas. So Alex is on. I want to go ahead and introduce him, and I'm going to let him introduce the topic. Hi, Alex. How are you doing?
How you doing, man? How are you, Rachel?
I'm very good. Thank you so much for taking the time and a lot of back-end work we did here to make this happen. Alex is very patient. So tell us a little about yourself, Alex. A little bit about your background, whatever it is you might want to share about yourself, about the topic. I'm just kind of open forum here, man.
Sure. So I was raised here in Panama City, Florida, spring break capital of the United States. And I went to school for psychology. That's my major. That's my thing. My shtick is the myelin sheath, that gray matter in your brain. Some of you may have heard of what the myelin sheath is. Some people haven't. And maybe I'll touch on that later. But I'm just a normal dude here, just trying to go to school, just trying to make a living. And I did run into a friend who introduced me to other schools of academia, and at the same time I met people like yourself on Facebook who I guess radicalized me. I guess is a good way to put it. And so a lot of things came together for me at I guess a precious time in my life, and there's a lot more to it, but I would say that everything that brought me here with you happened all around the same time, around 2010, 2011. And that had to do with me going to school, meeting my mentor, but also meeting ANCAPs and local anarchists.
Yeah. How long was, they say it's the difference between a libertarian and an ANCAP is about 6 months, right? I think that's.
Yeah. I think that the original joke is, what's the difference between a conservative and a libertarian?
I don't know that one.
An arrest record.
No.
and then what's the difference between a libertarian and an anarchist? Roughly 6 months.
Roughly 6 months. Took me a little bit longer. I'm hard-headed and a little bit slower. So, but we all get there on our own time. It's
for sure.
Such a big leap, man. I think just kind of like before we get into like the meat and potatoes, the topic is why Bitcoin, but I do want to. This question came up, and I love these questions that are spontaneous and just off the cuff. I think, I'm gonna tell you what radicalized me in terms of kind of being an ANCAP, and it's kind of like basic reading material. It's like maybe hour 5 of your 1,000 hours of study. The Law by Bastiat and Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson, man. Once I kind of understood the nature of government, not even Rothbard's Anatomy of the State. I'm talking about just Hazlitt and what he kind of lived through and how well he expressed what was going on in France. And then Hazlitt's, once I understood special interest and how basically the nature of the state is to where you're going to keep cascading the erosions of liberty and impositions of duties on others by virtue of the special interest, and then how opposing groups are always going to be at war, and then the more government controls, the more the more it's going to keep cascading, and it comes like a vicious cycle. That kind of the logical conclusion was like, man, this is never going to stop, and that to me, those two books that just
those are two good starters. Yeah. They're like propaganda pamphlets
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
libertarians. Like
Yep.
the law is like it's like a really thin little book,
Yeah. Easy
and then
read. Yep.
Hazlitt's is like it's a little thicker. It's like
Mm-hmm.
I think what 50, 60 pages.
Something like
It's
that.
a really good start, but they're both good starters because they're both short. They're very blunt and to the point, and it's hard to disagree with everything they say in those two books.
Absolutely. Very causal realist, I think, from Hazlitt's perspective. And yeah. So what, I guess what books motivated you the most in terms of like your intellectual journey on along these lines?
Well, I'm actually a little shocked. Those two were two of them. And it's funny you mentioned those two. They're actually a lot more popular within conservative circles than libertarian ones. As a
Mm.
matter of fact, the two different people who introduced me to those two books were local conservatives.
Right on.
And actually, ironically, the one who gave me the law was a guy who was trying to steer me away from what appeared to be radicalism on my end.
Okay.
And it actually further reinforced my radicalism, unfortunately for him. But those two were good starters. I would say, though, um, two books that had a very big impression on me were Machinery of Freedom,
Okay.
which is written by Friedman's
Yeah.
son, I
Mm-hmm.
believe is his son. And the other one is Crisis and Leviathan by Robert Higgs.
Okay.
And Robert Higgs, he's basically, an academic professor who taught like economics and history of economics.
Mm-hmm.
He started out a statist,
Mm-hmm. Didn't we
probably
all?
the one thing he didn't have in common with a statist was the fact that he didn't really agree with Keynesian, right? With Keynes.
Keynes. Yeah.
And over time, the more research he did and the more publishing he did and the more writing he did, the more he realized he was wrong, that academia was wrong. This school of economics that had been being pushed for decades was maybe not totally wrong, but they were getting some parts very wrong.
Yeah.
And it only took looking at history to see that. So Robert, for me, it isn't just his books; it's his journey. For
Mm-hmm.
me, means a lot to me. Someone who is, they're so, let's say, patriotic, right? They love their nation, and then they study their own nation, and they don't like what they see,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't like that a lot of the bad stuff that they do see is a result of this thing they love so much.
Really hard, man.
For me, that's a big thing.
It's really
It's the
hard.
people who they don't become anarchists because they're mad. They become anarchists because, or libertarians, because they read their own history. They
Exactly.
learn from history. Unfortunately, most people don't learn from history, even though it seems to repeat.
Or they look at it from a particular lens that doesn't lend itself to seeing the human nature within, let's say, a power structure that is
For sure, for
authoritarian,
sure.
that is the same across every other power structure that's authoritarian, that it's the same sort of results irrespective of what the country. And I think that's something that's really hard because I was in the Air Force. I was so I kind of can relate to how patriotic somebody can be and how you want to believe so badly that your country is the best and it's morally superior even though it's not perfect.
Yeah,
And I don't want to live anywhere else, but I can firsthand tell you, my conversion even to being just like a libertarian was pretty tough because I was pretty hardcore conservative. Before that, when in my younger years, I was pretty hardcore socialist, Medicare for all, healthcare for all. So I've kind of gone through all the phases. I agree with you on Robert Higgs, man. The lecture, "The State is Too Dangerous to Tolerate," was absolutely brilliant. I love watching that, and how he really expresses the reality of the state's, sort of negative externalities are here and now, and we have to
yeah,
imagine all the
yeah,
boogeymen that and all the what ifs, and that these arguments are not on equal footing. I think that's very very much paraphrasing a large segment of what he had on that video, and I absolutely love Robert Higgs. I actually have him as a friend on Facebook, and I'm too shy to ask him to be on the podcast. He's over in Mexico and living. He's retired. He probably Probably tired of talking
He's in the
about this
States
stuff.
now. He's in the States.
He's oh,
He's
is
been
he?
here for a while
Oh,
now.
really? I didn't
Yeah,
know
yeah.
that.
He
Okay.
ran into some health issues, I believe, and he hasn't. He left about 2 years ago. He's here in the States now.
Oh, okay. Oh, I did not know that.
Yeah.
But I mean, I still haven't reached out to him. I imagine he's got enough going on. But it would, it'd be a dream to have him on as well. I'm so glad that you and I are like pretty much read in the same circles. So curious to hear like what nuanced differences we might have in terms of like how we might speculate it would, let's say, go down if tomorrow we had anarchy. Like I have my idea of what would happen, the natural progression of things, and how kind of statism is kind of tribal. And but
We can start
yeah.
by defining anarchy, or defining how what we think anarchy is. And if you want to, I'll start that.
Yeah, we can.
Um,
I think we should definitely get into that. I kind of, if it's okay with you, Alex, I kind of wanted to get a little bit into the whole Bitcoin thing, and I think I don't know if we could argue Bitcoin is anarchy, but it's certainly a way of bypassing all the authoritarianism and really the
for
terrible
sure, for
monetary
sure.
policy of the Fed. Um, I think I definitely have my reasons, and I think we'll agree. I want to hear from you. What is it that let's say you like about Bitcoin? Why Bitcoin? Right?
Yeah, yeah,
Why
for
support
sure,
this
for sure,
amazing
for
thing?
sure. Um, so Bitcoin, a lot of people consider it sound money, right? Which means that there was a thing that we used to call sound money, and it's no longer sound, and now this new thing we're calling it sound, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and for a lot of people, including myself, Bitcoin is really a hedge against the Fed. Some people say it's a hedge against inflation, and that, I guess, if you define the Fed as
Synonymous.
inflation, then yeah, sure, for sure.
Yeah.
If the Fed is causing inflation, and yeah, this is a hedge against inflation. Um, it's also decentralized, unlike the Fed, unlike a lot of things, unlike governments usually are not centralized. Um, and then on top of the decentralization, there's like a hard limit cap. There's only a certain amount of Bitcoin. 21 million, if I remember right, 1 million locked up, saved aside for
Millions
Satoshi,
more
who
lost.
may or may not even be with us anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the fact of the matter that is that something like Bitcoin, and I'm talking in hindsight here. I'll get to more of like when I discovered Bitcoin, but in hindsight, Bitcoin is very much outside of the command and scope of what we consider authority, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as a behaviorist, a radical behaviorist, which I'll also touch on,
Mm-hmm.
for me, the way Bitcoin operates reminds me a lot of what we call schedules of reinforcement.
Okay.
Um,
You can break that down if you want to. I can, or I can pretend I know what that means. Just I
Okay,
have.
okay. Well, so let me get into. So I was in school,
Mm,
and my roommate, um, or my bad, he later became my roommate. My friend had a neighbor who needed something, and I could provide that thing. And it just so happens that they thought that we would be a good match because this guy was apparently in school for psychology. I'm in school for psychology. She just thought we'd click. So I said, yeah, sure, have him over. So she brought him over. I met him. Um, Outstanding lad. He seems in good shape. He's got a good head on his shoulders. He's definitely a lot smarter than me. And we became friends, and he invited me to be his roommate at a really nice condo. And basically, he'd be my mentor, pretty much line me up to become a radical behaviorist. Um, and and I would tell him what I've been learning about government, political science, philosophy. These are things that I was just starting to really start to dive into for like the first time. We would talk about all kinds of things. Um, Anyways, he introduced me to applied behavioral analysis. These are radical behaviorists. Um, what started this was a guy named B.F. Skinner back in the 50s. He's
heard
one
of
of the
him.
first behaviorists, which is
Mm-hmm.
just one of many schools of psychology. And he had some theories. He wrote some books. He wrote a book on behavior, human and animal behavior. Um, and he realized at some point that humans are animals. So he had to further distinguish between what an animal is and what a human is. So he wrote a book called Verbal Behavior. And really, his assumptions are we have no free will. All behavior comes from environment. And when I say environment, some people say nature versus nurture.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't use nature and nurture. He uses or the behaviors, the radical behaviors. They use behavior and environment. Anything you can sense, anything you can hear, touch, smell. This is all environment. And
Mm-hmm.
then right now, what I'm expressing is my behavior, but my behavior is also your environment, and vice versa.
Fair enough.
And he basically assumed that the root of all behavior is environment. Of course, there's the argument of genes and all that, and of course, genes play a role. But the idea is more like you have your genes and they kind of load the gun, but the environment triggers, right? And I can give you an example of that, and I will actually, so we can move forward. Let's assume that you're an Olympic swimmer.
Mm-hmm.
Let's assume that you have a child, and that your child is genetically predisposed to become an Olympic swimmer. If your child is not exposed to a pool or ocean or any swimming at all, that gene is not going to get expressed. They're not going to be an Olympic class swimmer. Since they're predisposed, maybe if you start them off at like 16, 17, 18-year old, they might pick it up really fast, faster than others, but they're not going to become an Olympic grade because you didn't start them off early. You didn't activate those genes early enough from the environment. There's a lot more nuance to it. That's just a fun little
Yeah.
example I like to give, just to give you an idea. So, as he passed on that information to me, I would pass on some of what I learned about the local politics, which is me experimenting, learning about politics, learning about corruption, because I would go to my city council's meetings and literally witness corruption.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time I was naive and young, and I used to view government as like the parents, and the people are the children, right?
Mm-hmm. Very paternal
And I
view of.
realized that these are some shitty adults. These are not good parents, and this is corruption. And I thought it was just a local thing. I thought maybe this is an isolated case,
Mm-hmm.
but no. What I was witnessing, I would later find out was happening all around the nation. But let me fast forward a little bit. So my roommate, um, college guy, uh, he introduced me to Bitcoin.
Okay.
He found out a way to get the things that I was providing for him with Bitcoin. Um, I don't want to be too vague. Totally dealing drugs. Let's just put it that way.
Okay. Gotcha. It's
And he
Silk
was
Road
showing me
maybe.
how to use the deep web. And on the deep web, there are a whole bunch of black markets.
Mm-hmm.
And let me put a pin in that, black markets. And the only thing they took was Bitcoin. And at the time, Coinbase was the only place I was aware of where you could buy Bitcoin, and
Mm-hmm.
it was going for, at the time, I think less than $1.
Wow.
By the time I started to pay attention, it hit $1, but even when it was in the dollar, it was on average in the dollars. It wasn't going too high or too low. And I was buying a lot of it and using a lot of it to buy stuff on the deep web.
Fair enough.
The deep web was a lot cheaper. It had better quality things, so you had good quality products for a lot cheaper prices, which is kind of weird, right? You
Well,
never think you'd get a higher quality item for less money, right?
well.
So that was kind of something that piqued my interest.
Mm-hmm.
But at some point, um, I noticed that the graphs for Bitcoin, um, as I watched it every day, weeks passed by, months passed by, I realized that I was able to predict the values of Bitcoin, at least a little bit. I can somewhat predict them. I could basically tell you, it's going to go up and down. It's going to go up like 5% and down 4% every day this week, and probably for the next couple weeks. I
Mm-hmm.
might project 5 weeks, and then after like 3 weeks, something changes. But you get used to that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that it was so predictable that I could just buy it low and sell it high. So instead of flipping drugs, I started flipping Bitcoin, and then I started trading it because I realized there were other cryptocurrencies, and some of these were I mean, I didn't really know the difference between them. I didn't know that Bitcoin was special. I didn't think it was special. I thought they were all equally special. And then I started asking my mentor about it, and he would tell me, no, 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 these are all different. Bitcoin is not like Ethereum, and these are two different animals. They should not be treated the same, and they probably do the same on the graph. You could probably flip them just like you're doing, Alex, but they're not the same. So I started to do more research, and I discovered how mysterious this thing was. I actually didn't believe it. I honestly um, thought, and still sometimes think from here and then, is that this was some sort of government operation. It just seemed a
Yeah.
little convenient and out of nowhere. And I'm like, only a government could do something like this, right? And when you find out about SCA 256, I believe I got that right, the algorithm that Bitcoin runs on, I was like, this is made by the NSA. Doesn't that make this a government operation, right? But then I start learning about uh, like CryptoPunks, cypherpunks,
Mm-hmm.
um, and then I realized that I already knew some on Facebook. I already knew some. I had been seeing them on Facebook. I had been commenting on their posts. I had been debating them as a statist,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I wanted to know more about Bitcoin, so I would ask them. Um, and one of the guys who really got in my ear was someone who changed my mind on something so fucking silly, spanking. We're debating spanking.
Like
And this is
like
like
kids.
spanking a child.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah, like literally, this is for me. This is a hot topic debate, and
Really?
actually, it still very much is.
Okay.
But for me, it was a new one. It was like, how can anyone be against spanking their children? How can anyone be against disciplining their kids? And that's how I thought about it. Now I think about it as like, how is anyone okay with hitting their children? And notice I changed my language there, right? I went from spanking to hitting, and I would be like, that's not the same thing. And they're like, is spanking hitting? And I just felt so fucking stupid.
Hmm.
Like, yeah, spanking is hitting. We're hitting kids. And I would try to justify and defend hitting kids. Like, yeah, okay, we're hitting kids, but we have to hit kids. But it's like, would you hit your adult wife? Like, isn't that a crime? Wouldn't you go to jail for that? And just little stuff like that started to really hit on me, and I started to realize, well, they're not wrong, right? And after he had convinced me that spanking is bad, period, like 100%, like this shouldn't even be a last resort, that's when I started thinking, oh, well, what else could I be wrong about? And the person I'm referring to, you might know I'm talking about, is Sterling Lujan.
Oh yeah. Absolutely.
So he's the one he's the one who kicked my ass on spanking. He's the one who turned me, so to speak. He wasn't the first anarchist, though. The first anarchists were locals. One of them was an ANCAP. You might know him too, Tho Bishop.
I've
He's a
heard of them.
local. He's the coordinator, the media coordinator at the Mises Institute, which isn't too far from here.
Mm-hmm.
At the Auburn University, I believe. I think it is. But these are the ones who really started to make me think and reconsider my positions and my opinions. And one of the things that led to my curiosity was definitely like, who are these people? What is ideology? Is this actually philosophy? Um, and so, yeah, that's pretty much
And
how that
we're
all
talking about it.
started.
Uh,
And
yeah.
yeah,
So ideology in terms of is there efficacy in the idea of, let's say, anarcho-capitalism, as we were saying, like you were. I think that's a very. I think we all struggle with that when we're starting to cross that line. One thing that I think is a common ground in all of us that are more liberty loving. I mean, and not from the perspective of like your traditional sort of American, sort of classic liberal sort of point of view, is you do have to sort of deprogram a lot of things that you've sort of had to believe in. So I think there's a natural curiosity that we have that might lend to some of what you're saying in terms of your behavioral sort of analysis. Um, I think that I don't know what I think about all that, and I'd hate to steer. I hate to talk about something I don't know about completely. I could say it sounds interesting, and I'd love to talk more about it. And we can probably make a whole other show about that. I could also make a whole other show
For
about
sure, for sure.
spanking. We may disagree on a few things, but I'd be curious to hear more in detail, maybe in the future, like what specific arguments and so on. I'm
Yeah,
Hispanic. I
for
think
sure, for
I think
sure.
you're Hispanic, right, Alex? Or are you
Yes,
not?
I'm Puerto Rican.
Oh, bueno, yes, I'm Cuban, so I don't know how
Qué bien,
I
qué
got
bien.
many pelas, and I think I'd argue
Yeah,
I'm better I'm
me
better
too.
for it.
Chancleta y todo. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but that'd be an interesting man. So why Bitcoin for me? I think I got into Bitcoin much later. I was actually you know kind of introduced to Bitcoin in, I want to say, 2022. It was during like the government shutdowns and the COVID era, and I remember Bitcoin it was maybe $19,000 or so, right? So I was
Mhm.
part of that wave, and it wasn't that I just never I don't have a lot of friends that are like minded. I have nobody, let's say, in my physical reality, like let's say people I commute
Yeah, and the surrounding, yeah, for sure, for
interact
sure. Now
with
I feel you. Yeah,
that
you feel alone.
exactly. So all the research I did was of my own fruition, and I never really even had much of a dialogue. I've just read a lot and seen a lot of videos and lectures on Mises or otherwise. So since I wasn't in that circle, I wasn't looking for Bitcoin, so to speak.
Hmm.
So I didn't really know about it, man, until much later in
Uh-huh.
my journey. And I was a full blown libertarian, and because I was kind of a lone wolf, nobody had mentioned, hey, have you heard about Bitcoin? If I
Yeah,
knew
yeah, yeah,
the
yeah,
mechanics of Bitcoin, the economics of Bitcoin,
for sure.
back
And
then,
if you're straight edge, you're definitely not going to find out, right?
yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, so that why Bitcoin for me was, well, it's an economic imperative, it's a moral imperative. It's bypassing the
Hmm.
Fed. It's again sticking it to the centralized structures that basically erode our purchasing power and tell us
Right,
what we can
right,
buy,
right,
what we
right.
can't buy, and try to extort what we make to fuel their machinations, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
And
didn't really think about like how our money works
mm-hmm,
until Bitcoin.
mm-hmm.
Matter of fact, I figured out how Bitcoin worked before I actually figured out how the rest, like how
Okay.
money's currencies usually work. Like I didn't know the difference between money and currency, you know. So, but let's say from a behaviorist perspective,
Mm-hmm,
once I realized the difference, what really mattered was stability of the currency, right?
mm-hmm,
And I mentioned schedules reinforcement. So it's currency stability and the reinforcement schedules that we operate under. Those are
mm-hmm.
critical. And because predictable contingencies maintain stable patterns of behavior. If something's predictable and it does the same thing over and over again, you can kind of rest assured that there's nothing being manipulated here.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
That's like an
So,
axiom or a basic tenet of the behavioral sort of analysis you're talking about.
yeah, just looking at it from a
Okay.
behavioral perspective.
Okay.
Like, so fiat money, it has its, let's say, its endless supply of expansions.
Mm-hmm.
It imposes unpredictable outcomes, especially on people who are saving money. Right, we were talking earlier about that, and in entrepreneurs, people who are trying to make money, trying to make a living,
Mm-hmm. It
um,
distorts
they're
signals.
reinforcing a reliance on central authorities and they're shifting policies. But Bitcoin is like it's elastic, or rather, its
Inelastic.
inelasticity is
Uh-huh.
like it's an issuance. It's an issuance. Like the algorithms, the fact that it is an algorithm that it's doing this thing over and over and over again. It's an issuance.
Okay.
It's an issuance that is more transparent and again predictable, unlike some things like the way our money works, the value of our dollar, even
Mm-hmm.
stocks. Even stocks are very unpredictable. Now, people might say, well, Bitcoin's volatile. Um, I always argue against this. I don't like that word anymore because volatility first off, volatility isn't a bad thing, and they're saying it like it's a bad thing. Two, when they say volatility, usually they mean it's random or unpredictable. But I can tell you that every 4 years, what's happening right now in Bitcoin is going to happen roughly every 4 years. The fact that I can say that, the fact that I have said that over and over and over again, and it has happened over and over again, shows a pattern and
Yeah.
shows something that's predictable,
What only
right?
thing I could say to that, Alex, is on the margin, right? On the margin, when you're trying to buy coffee,
Mhm.
there's a great argument to say Bitcoin is, whether you want to call it volatile or you want to call it
Mhm.
unpredictable in terms of
For sure, yeah. If
what
you're
it's
not
going to
trying
resolve
to,
that.
if you're trying to spend it like that, yeah, yeah, yeah,
Exactly, and I think
for sure,
that's a
absolutely.
key distinction we have to make, in my opinion, between Bitcoin and so Bitcoin as akin to gold versus dollars. You don't really want to go and
Right, 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 right,
spend your
for
dollar
sure,
on
for sure.
Starbucks, your gold on Starbucks, and I think that's a very key thing. And obviously, there is volatility because it's new tech. We're in the very early stages of the adoption curve. We're probably still very early. And that volatility is obviously, there isn't a huge relative to the money that is available, right? This is me talking in terms of like how I see it, right? So it could be wrong,
Mm-hmm.
but in terms of the available market cap, since we're so early on, there's a lot of money flowing in and out at all times, where the volume of the market cap isn't high enough yet to where that that standard deviation of inflows and outflows into the asset can be absorbed and diluted to where it seems stable. But obviously, when that happens, it's going to be too late, right? So,
Sure, sure,
so
sure.
I think that's kind of how, I don't know what you think about that, but that's kind of how I see the volatility argument. And in terms of what you're saying, the halving cycle, in terms of how you could predict that over time the trajectory is up, higher highs, higher lows, it only stands to reason that if you it over the last 15 years now, has it been 15 years, 16 years?
What, Bitcoin?
Yeah, 15 years, right?
13, almost 14
Is it
years.
14 years?
I want to say 15.
Um, it,
Started in 2009.
yeah, I laugh at people who still don't think it's at least an asset worth investing into and looking into and holding and seeing what happens.
Especially now. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I convinced my next door neighbor, I won't say his name, but he was a finance guy, person at a bank. He was a banker, and he was in the investing side, and he managed portfolios for people. He had a portfolio of people's, I guess, portfolios, and he was very much like, maybe more like a Dave Ramsey type, but he dabbled a little bit more into the stock market. And he made, he's retired, and I live in a pretty good neighborhood, and he's he's set for the rest of his life. He's retired, and he did pretty well. He was always against Bitcoin. He was always curious, but he was against it for many reasons. Hardcore conservative type. The dollar is not going anywhere. The U.S. Reserve
For him, the
current,
issue was risk.
it was probably risk. And I was like, man, I'm telling you. And of course, he hit 100,000 the other day, and it was amazing. And I wish I had a bigger position than I did. But
Yeah, yeah.
he came
That's.
over.
I
He's
mean,
like,
it's
dude,
totally
like, you're
fair
right. He said you're
to
right. It was
for
like
him to
amazing.
like see it as risky.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned earlier, like on the margins, buying Bitcoin, buying coffee with Bitcoin probably doesn't work. But that's if you're looking at the short term.
Right.
Because for sure, if he buys in, at the peak, he's going to lose 80% more than likely because
At some
that's what
point.
happens every
At some point.
cycle, right?
Yep.
So
Yes, sir.
now, but if he's looking at it long term, then that risk is not really there. It doesn't really exist.
Mm-hmm.
To touch back on how the reinforcing contingencies are more transparent and predictable, the fact that the contingencies are transparent and, from my perspective, predictable, this shifts the locus of control from large institutions to individuals.
Yes.
This is a main thing for a lot of
Absolutely.
people who are interested in Bitcoin. And if that matters, then Bitcoin is your thing. For a lot of people, that may not matter. That they're not really. A lot of people, they like their banks, or they're not really worried about whether or not they can trust their bank. Like, probably for most people, most of their lives, the bank probably doesn't screw them over. It really only screws over the people who use the bank as for investments, or who put their all their savings in there, and certain things happen to certain banks. But that's on the margins. That doesn't really happen
Absolutely.
too often. And when it does, when a lot of people are affected, it's usually people who are probably better off than both of us,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So for a lot of people, that's not an issue. But if you're a principled person, I would say, I think that's a good way to put it, principled,
Mm.
libertarian, anarchist, or hell, just a principled conservative who
Yeah.
likes to be careful with their investments, that matters a lot to them. And it's not just about shifting control to individuals, it's also about networks of voluntary participants. And that goes on to the nodes and how each node is ran by different people and
Mm-hmm.
they're all around the world. And on one level, this is good for individuals. On another level, this is good for decentralization. On another level, it's good for security. It's a lot harder to hack Bitcoin for that reason. So, just that alone is a good basis for a lot of different arguments you can use to prop up Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
If I really had to argue my life on Bitcoin, and which I probably will for the rest of my life,
Mm-hmm.
those are things I would touch on. A lot of people don't care about those things, but that is a good basis, and all the arguments that sit on top of that basis are things people do care about.
Mm-hmm.
Um, with that said, over the long term, as more people adopt Bitcoin, which I expect to continue happening,
Likewise.
I expect the Federal Reserve to get more pressure, a lot more pressure to justify discretionary
I think
policies.
they're going to buy Bitcoin at some point. I think.
They are already buying
Oh,
Bitcoin,
really? I
and
didn't
if
know
they're
that.
not buying Bitcoin,
Oh.
they've at the very least, taken Bitcoin and have sold it. I don't know if it's the Fed who's in charge of that, but I know that the government has uh, somehow come into a lot of Bitcoin, and
Wasn't it?
they've
Isn't it the Mount
it might be
Gox?
from. I know they got some
Mount Gox.
from the Silk Road,
The
both
Silk Road.
Silk Roads, by the way, because they had infiltrated the second Silk Road 6 months before it was known to anyone. But they didn't get all their Bitcoin just from that. But I do know they did auction a lot of that, and for a good price too. By the way,
Mm-hmm.
they're really if you want a reason not to trust um, the Fed, your own government's monetary policers or whatever, um, that would be a reason not to trust them. Like they had all this Bitcoin, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they sold it for practically nothing. Had they held it, they could be using that for the reserve. They could be using it to pay people back in taxes, which they're going to do. Otherwise, they
Yeah.
wouldn't be asking you for the last year, anyways, if you would accept cryptocurrency for your tax refunds. They wouldn't ask that if they didn't at least consider it.
That's a good point.
So that's something to know. I'm pretty sure they
Oh,
are
that's kind
not
of the
just considering
Treasury,
that.
and I could see they're kind of inextricably.
And by the way, the Treasury needs Bitcoin to do that. So
Mm-hmm.
obviously, they either already have Bitcoin or have plans to buy it. So if they haven't already bought it, you're right. They're going to buy it.
I
I
think that's
suspect, though, that
necessary.
they already have Bitcoin.
You know why
You know,
Bitcoin and you know I'm sure you agree. I was hoping you'd say it, but it's just that fiat is guaranteed to keep diluting, and
yeah, for sure.
unless you think we're gonna have an how do you say apocalyptic level event where internet isn't even around and all I don't know all electricity goes away somehow, which at that point we have bigger problems, right? So I figure either the world goes to it blows itself up somehow, and that in sort of that apocalyptic sense, or Bitcoin just continues to outpace fiat, and because that there to me there's only that's a dichotomy to me, either if Bitcoin exists, then fiat cannot succeed relative to Bitcoin, and that's it. It's very simple, because governments will continue to spend, and politicians will continue to promise, and they'll carry deficits, which will get basically they'll keep debasing the money to pay for all the things that the politicians are promising. And since the government's grown so large in scope and it's become almost like a requirement, all the ideologue of status, I don't want to call them ideologues, but all the status want more and more, and the standards keep raising for what they want government to do, that costs money, right? So
No,
I
no, you're
figure
right. If there's a growing alternative that people can easily shift toward, the Fed's capacity to manipulate interest rates and the money supply will be constrained, and
Absolutely.
people would be less susceptible to the levers of central banking because their behavior, i.e., their economic actions,
Mm-hmm.
can shift to a monetary environment that's stable
Mm-hmm.
and beyond centralized manipulation. So yeah, you're right, and I expect that to happen. Um, I mean, like best case scenario, that's exactly what happens. And worst case scenario, they start endorsing Bitcoin themselves. And either way is a win, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Either way is absolutely a win, in my opinion.
Especially if they have
I
an
mean, the
incentive.
fact that they recognize Bitcoin as a commodity, that was the
That was
day
huge.
Bitcoin won, in my
That
opinion.
was
To be
huge.
honest, with regard to government.
Here's a tough question. Well, I don't know if it's a tough question. Um, how much of the Bitcoin, price action lately do you think is election driven, regime certainty driven, Bitcoin, or rather Trump certainty, from the regime perspective? He seems to be a little favorable. He's gone. Yeah, it didn't go so well for him at the Libertarian convention for Trump,
So
but he seems to be sort of trying to ally more with, which I think is funny. And I don't want to talk about Trump. He's not a Libertarian. He's not any.
right, 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 right. I used to joke
But
that he was the ANCAP president.
yeah, Pres. I mean, Walter Block famously voted for him. The first election cycle, he had
Yeah, yeah,
libertarians for
yeah.
Trump, and I respect Walter Block a lot. His writings, and I like his kind of his unapologetic sort of take on, well, defending the indefendable, right, and kind of how talking about taking those who would build the roads, and he learned me to think from first principles along those lines. And but in any case, he voted for Trump, and I don't think I think, man, one thing that even Robert Higgs agrees to is go live your life, don't be a martyr for this. You're against, like, what do you call the people in government? He called them, you're against fiends. You're against fiends that, and you shouldn't let their way your life. You should try to be happy. I remember him having a very
Yeah, yeah,
specific
yeah, yeah.
conversation about that, and I think it's so true, man. So, like, on this podcast, I talk a lot about having a sense of proportion. So I'm an ANCAP ideologically, um, and but pragmatically, like, I will not get in the way of progress. So if I don't. There's a lot of things that are going in the wrong direction from Trump's perspective, but there are a lot of things that were going relative to the other side. I mean, I voted for libertarians. I know it's a losing ticket, but I've also been part of that population. I wasn't too excited about Charlie. I was definitely not excited about Gary, although I did vote for Gary. And I don't. There's a lot of infighting, and man, I don't know, man. Politically, it's just
No, no, I
it's a
totally get it.
terrible.
When I first became an ANCAP, ANCAPs and ANCOMs used to somewhat get along. We had groups of ANCAPs and ANCOMs who debated.
Are you in the debate group
They
on
were
Facebook,
they
by the way, Alex? ANCAP
do what?
versus ANCOM. Are you in that debate group on Facebook, the ANCAP versus ANCOM?
Probably, but I don't know if
Uh,
it's the original. And if it
oh,
is
okay, okay.
original, it's not what it used to be. Like seriously, we used to get along. It used to be very civil. Like communists
Mm-hmm.
and like ANCOMs and ANCAPs used to actually get along for the most part. They used to be, at the very least,
Civil.
civil. I swear to God, that really was a thing
Okay.
back then.
I never would have
Obviously, we've
thought.
been
Fair enough. To be
we've been
honest.
we've been polarized to the max though. Like once I want to say I want to say we got along under Obama, and then after his first term, it just got really polarized, and we stopped getting along. But to answer your question though, if I how I think Bitcoin is influenced by externalities, basically,
Mm-hmm.
I actually feel a little alone in my view of this. You can consider it the unpopular opinion, and I
Okay.
could be totally wrong. So since I've been able to make the predictions that I make, the long-term predictions, I always feel like if I'm able to make these predictions, either one, nothing is affecting Bitcoin. There are no externalities that really affect Bitcoin, at least not enough to make a difference. Or I'm not the only one who is making these projections the way I am, and they are timing events and their actions at certain times to either maximize change or make it look like they're the ones affecting them. I'll give you an example.
Are you talking about the
Every four
psychology of market
years.
participants, basically, in a sense?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay,
So
okay.
like for example, every 4 years we have this bull run, right?
Hmm.
And I actually haven't seen it happen yet, unless I missed it and just hasn't been reported. But consistently, right before the first big dip, that was around the time that China would ban mining,
I remember that.
right? And a
Yeah.
lot of people would be, oh look, this is what China did this by banning the Chinese miners. They've affected Bitcoin's price. But I always found it kind of convenient that that happened every 3 or 4 years. It also it just so happens to fall on this, like the stock market also has a 4 year cycle. And one thing that's very popular is the stock to flow
Yep.
projections. And
Hmm.
really the assumption here is that basically stocks hit a sort of peak or cap of their own, and those high caps flow into the lower caps, in this case, Bitcoin.
Hmm.
And then Bitcoin gets up, and that flows into the next one, usually Ethereum. So we have a Bitcoin season, we have an Ethereum season, and then those caps would flow into the alt. So
Do
we
you
get
couple
altcoin season.
Ethereum with altcoins in terms of altcoin season, or do you just mean Ethereum
So
in a
that
course like this?
it's funny you ask. So
Hmm.
I think there's a Bitcoin season, an Ethereum season, and an altcoin season. And
Okay,
Ethereum is
I
not part
dude,
of the
I've never
altcoin
heard that,
season.
but um,
And I say that because
mhm.
usually Ethereum will go up with Bitcoin, but not at the same time. There's usually some sort of delay, which we're watching right now. It's
Hmm.
finally starting to go up. And when Bitcoin goes down, Ethereum will keep going up, or it'll get to the point to where it'll shortly after go down. But it usually follows pretty well. And then you get all the other, like anything that's not Ethereum, pretty much goes up. There are some exceptions, but those exceptions are not consistent. Like um, Tether, which is a stable coin pretty
Yep,
much,
yep.
that really did some weird things a couple times. Like it has gone above the stable medium a couple
It's
times.
going under it too.
It's also gone below.
Yeah,
Um,
yep,
and there's a lot to discuss with that one, but that's like a whole another
yep.
episode of
That's a big
itself.
rabbit hole. Yeah, agreed. Yeah.
There's theories about there being some sort of conspiracy between big Bitcoin holders and Tether being backed by Bitcoin, and so on and so on. But just to go on the question, not to go on a tangent,
Hmm.
I honestly, personally, me, I don't think Bitcoin is really affected by anything, or at least nothing can affect it very well. I think it totally relies on human behavior, and the only thing that
Okay,
really affects it is the money going in and out of it.
here we go.
All right. So I think that all these events that people think affect Bitcoin's value, I don't think they really affect it. I think it's all more organic and natural than that. I think people are just moving money based on how they feel, just like the stock market. And I think all the events and news reports are just conveniently happening at times that
Hmm.
Bitcoin values go up and down, fluctuate.
Okay.
Um, I mean, if you see your Bitcoin go from 40, then 50, then 60, obviously you're going to make some moves. People are going to behave in a certain way. People are going to sell. Some other ones are going to buy. Some of those are going to trade. Um, Reports are going to go out. Those reports are going to get read. People are going to act on those. But I don't think it makes much of a difference. I think the trajectory is always the same because the season is the same.
Hmm.
Like the election is 4 years long. So things that you would normally do at the end of an election season, you're not doing at the beginning of an election season or midway through the election season.
I'd hate to give
Just like
credibility to the state, but do you think the election being a 4 year cycle also has is it coincidental that the market in terms of its cycles is also 4 years? I don't know also what the parity is in terms of year to year. I know the
so
regime's uncertainty drives market participants a lot. Game theory is
for sure, absolutely, absolutely.
I feel like it couldn't be a coincidence, right? It couldn't,
The reason I
but
think the election isn't much of a thing because we had a 4 year term president in Obama,
yeah, we uh huh
or my bad, 8 year, my bad,
8 year.
2 term, 8 years,
I hate to
right?
admit that I
And
voted for
then
him too.
we had a four, and another four. Bitcoin didn't change. It kept doing its same thing despite that, despite one president having 2 terms, the next president having one. Biden having one, then Trump having one again. Nothing changed. You would think that something would have been different between Obama's two-term presidency and
Mm-hmm.
Trump's one term followed by, and then maybe something happened under Biden. But none of that, nothing changed. It was the same exact thing happened. The only constant really was the market cycle, which is probably more relevant. That's where the money's coming from. We can
Mm-hmm.
see that. We can see that when Bitcoin goes up, it's pretty much because people took out of their stock.
Yeah.
Um, and really, it might there might even be a delay. You'll see the stock market crash first, and then within a couple of weeks, not really the day after, but a couple of weeks after, then Bitcoin will do its thing. So is that because people waited to put their money in the Bitcoin? Or is there something else going on here that's causing a delay, or is it because it doesn't affect Bitcoin at all? And I think it's that last one. I think that's really how it is. And maybe I'm exaggerating when I say not at all. Really, I really want to say not much. It doesn't make a difference.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
In the
I do
grand scheme of
think
things.
that the more people notice, the more adoption we're going to have. And I think adoption does play a role. I think adoption is the reason every cycle has a higher cap.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that along with, and then everything else is just has to do with how Bitcoin itself is designed. So, for example, the halvening, right? When the halvening happens, the reward when you mine a Bitcoin is halved,
Halves.
right?
Yep.
So at first you would mine a whole fucking Bitcoin,
Mm-hmm.
and then after the first happening, you would only get half a Bitcoin. You get zero point 0.5, and then you would do half of zero point 0.5, 2.5.
Mm-hmm.
Then you do half of that, and we're like on the fifth happening, the fourth, fifth
Yep.
happening. That's
Fourth.
that is going to keep going. So it's technically going to get harder to get more Bitcoin in circulation, but that's a good thing, right? It actually is like a balance to the limit because you're
Mm-hmm.
thinking, oh, there's only 21 million Bitcoin. Well, how long do you think it's going to take to mine 21 million Bitcoin if the amount is
I don't
half
think you and I will
and
see
we
it.
have do it?
I don't think you and I will see the last Bitcoin being mined.
Yeah, yeah. Well, who knows? But I think the
Take a heck of a
idea
lot of
was, if
energy.
you did the math, it was like something like around 100 years. And
Yep.
yes, I'll definitely be dead before then, but our kids might actually see that.
Yeah.
And those of us who are lucky enough to live over 100 might see that too, maybe. And it's also possible that it might not take 100 years. My understanding is that the time limit is actually reduced a little because our technology has gotten better. Um,
Yeah, I don't know how much that prediction takes into account the exponential rate of technological advancement relative to,
yeah,
processing,
yeah, for
crypto
sure.
processing and stuff like
Like
that. But
quantum computing
energy,
was in
though,
our thoughts, but AI wasn't really in our thoughts. We didn't really
yeah,
consider how we would come up with AI that we have today and how that might help us get to quantum computing even
yeah,
faster. But we did know about quantum computing. The people who were behind Bitcoin, they
had to have.
totally they see it. We
Mm-hmm.
already have quantum proofs. Matter of fact, one common argument against Bitcoin is like, hey, once the quantum computer gets out, that thing's hacked. That's not true. We have quantum proofs already. You can run them on classical computers.
So it's really fascinating to me, man. It's understanding, or someone who understands a little bit more, maybe the cipher side or the crypto side of it, like how
I
the
could definitely
logic works.
know more. I just happen to bump shoulders with
Yeah.
some core developers, some of them who were involved in the development of Bitcoin. At least one of them, his paper is cited.
Mm-hmm.
Like his work was used to design Bitcoin.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
So and there's a good meme that I like to share every once in a while that shows like the history of the technology that led to Bitcoin. This is really like 100, maybe 200-year-old project
Mm-hmm.
if you think about it. Um, and that's probably like one of the best ways to look at it is like we didn't get here because some anarchists who didn't like government, the Fed, wanted to design their own money. Like, no, 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 no. We have problems. The Fed was designed to solve a problem. Banks were designed to solve a problem. They're not just a ledger. Um, Ledgers were used to solve problems in ancient times,
Mm-hmm.
but these they don't solve all the problems. The alone doesn't solve a problem. That's why we came up with banks. And there's other forms of lending that have popped up here and there throughout history. Some of them are still used in some cultures. In more modern times here in the United States, we have the Federal Reserve, and that was supposed to fix some problems. And if I want to be pragmatic about it, maybe it could, maybe it does fix certain problems, but we couldn't fix all the problems. There's a lot of problems, and uh, coming up with computers changed that a lot for good and for worse. And the more problems we came up with, the more solutions we had to think about. And
Mm-hmm.
Bitcoin is literally a culmination of several types of solutions: mathematical solutions, solutions based on trust, privacy, transparency.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I mean, this algorithm is like meant to be basically an automatic ledger, and that sounds so simple, but that is such a powerful idea because like it's like if a bank is people running a ledger, then you're pretty much automating a bank.
Yep. And it's well,
And
and you can
what is
audit
that?
it at any time and
Right,
see
right, right. And what does
every
that
single
mean for the
transaction.
future? Like, what does an automated bank do to society, to civilization? Like, if we know what a Fed does, or a central bank in general, a lot of countries have central banks, right? What happens when you automate those things? Do they make things better or worse? And my argument is like we got bad results without the automation, and probably because just humans are just terrible, right? We probably need automation because humans are terrible. We just can't trust humans to do it. But also, it has less to do with trust and more to do with the fact that we're fallible. So even if we could be trustworthy, and even if we were, omniscient and benevolent, we can still screw up.
Yeah.
And I was actually going to bring that up with regard to keenness. Like I wanted to provide like
Mm-hmm.
a simple counter against it, and really the most basic counter against him is that Keynes posited that centralized agencies can fine tune the economy. They can, pull some levers, and if something's bad over here, we can fix that. If something's too low over here, we can hire that. But it rests on the grand assumption that bureaucracies are both omniscient
And benevolent or noble
and
or
benevolent,
or
right?
not or non-evil
So,
maybe as a
yeah,
basis.
yeah, yeah, for sure, for
Yeah.
sure. And
Yeah.
if that were true, sure, maybe Keynes would be right. Maybe the Fed would work out. But
What Keynes also gets wrong, and what Keynesians also get wrong, is the idea that basically you can treat people like a controlled study, like some controlled variables, and we change our minds. We don't change. We're not. So when you're measuring indifference and try to create better outcomes by measuring, let's say, you know, the utility of this or that, especially when
right, right.
ordinal versus cardinal utility. I'm sure you're familiar with that concept.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah,
so,
yeah.
so these they try to cardinally rank these things and measure indifference and show like, well, this is a benefit overall to society based off these factors and all these people, and
Well,
that they treat them
let,
the
let me give
physics
Keynes
envy of it all.
something there.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
There is some credence there. Even even ANCAPs or even people of the Austrian School of Economics persuasion, even they believe, and probably rightfully so, I believe as well, that economics is more of like the study of behavior. Like economics is probably a better study of behavior than psychology.
So are you
So,
I don't want to say conflating. That's not the right word. That's kind of a pejorative term. Are
what I
you
was getting is that
extending
if
human
Keynes,
action
like,
to human behavior, like in the Mises axiom? The action axiom. Is that kind of what you're referring to?
uh,
I'm sorry if I'm
so what's it called? What was that school of
praxeology.
thinking? Yes, praxeology.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, this kind of comes from Keynes. That's kind of influence from Keynes. Keynes thinks, we could use this to study, and he's kind of right. If this is the study of behavior, if economics is a really good representation of human behavior, of human action, then yeah, we probably could study it. We probably could infer a lot of data information. Keynes, I can give him credit with that one, I think. and only because of praxeology, only because we've kind of already taken that idea to make sense of it. So in that sense, he might be right. I think what he got wrong was his intuition, and it wasn't so much that he thought that the bureaucracy was benevolent or whatever. I think it was more like he thought that these were things that could be corrected through monetary policy. Like you can use money like a fish on a pole to uh, to manipulate people into making better decisions. But that's not like that's just a failure to understand simple game theory, right? Praxology is pretty much applying game theory to the same idea. So really, that's what Keynes is missing there.
I've never
So
thought of
you've
praxeology
got
as a game
something.
theory, but I kind of see where you're going, and I'm, I am struggling a little bit to understand the extension of praxeology to Keynes, because praxeology really is just a series of logical deductions. One axiomatic truth leads to another, right? It's a logical sort of a ideology where we get more grounded principles to sort of deduce from, and I think the Austrian school does really good at from the causal realist perspective, coming up with better. I hate to say predictions, but it's if I could reject your premises, I could reject everything that comes after it, right? And I feel where Keynes went wrong in his premises is that he, and I don't know Keynes personally. I've actually read the General Theory. It was many years ago, and it was very difficult for me to get through. I got through it as a matter of Socratic study because I felt like I had to do it. But he treats people like static, sort of controlled variables that don't change their minds. And I feel from there he infers many things, and Keynesians evolve and extrapolate from that premise and then try to measure indifference and then justify transfer payments from class A to class
For sure, for
B.
sure, for
And I
sure.
kind of feel like that's where he gets it wrong. I don't think he's evil. I just think he's wrong. And I feel like what do you say? Let's get into some of the questions. What do you say to people to to criticize? Let's say, for example, like I'm sure you know Jonathan Kaplan, right? You probably know Jonathan Kaplan. He goes on Mises a lot. He's
Yeah,
on
yeah, yeah,
Heritage.
yeah, yeah.
So
Happens great.
he's got a whole article about why I'm not a Austrian, right? So he's
Yeah,
very much, to your point, someone who defend Keynes, at least in his methodologies, because it's empirical, right? As opposed to where the Austrian school is not, which I would argue the Austrian school is more empirical, more grounded. We just don't make predictive we don't find use in coming up with predictive sort of econometrics, because at the end of the day, what do they lend themselves to? Well, creating policy decisions that create status machinations. so
right.
like so
Yes,
that's
yes.
that's where I agree with Keynesians, because sure, if you want to go study how maybe rent control in this particular case doesn't affect the supply of housing, and in this rare circumstance, sure, maybe there's something, but on absolute terms, I would argue if you basically increase the cost by lowering the profit margin that you can get from your investment by minimizing the margin on your profit by rent control, I would argue that by virtue of the cost, you're going to get less supply of that overall. That less people are going to enter the market. So it's kind of like higher cost decreases quantity demanded, right? So
Mhm.
I would argue, like, if you wanted to study that on a field where you're not trying to impose duties on others based off of that study, sure, go knock yourself out. But in terms of from a liberty perspective, I feel like the Austrian school is pretty much all you need in terms of economics, and
Sure, yeah.
you
It's a
know
lot more grounded.
it's my and that's kind of I think it's good enough, and I don't know econometrics or stuff like that,
I mean, it's good enough that it
but
seems to work in practice.
yes, and I
Are you
think,
keeping up with what's going on in Argentina?
dude, I love what Mile is doing. I mean, I talk about him a
That's
little bit on the show.
practice, and I think
Yes,
he's proving it. I think he's
he is.
showing that it works.
Dude, let's take a second
Although,
on a tangent there, Ben. Just real quick. Like, I love how. So, I talked about this on a previous show. So, he is an ANCAP. He's an Austrian economist.
yeah,
He's a fellow
an
traveler.
actual
He's
AMCAP
an
president.
actual ANCAP president. It's amazing. And did he get rid of every single ministerio on day one? No. He actually kept like half of them, or 7 of the 11, or 11 of the 7. I don't know.
Yeah,
And I think it's a very pragmatic approach, because you have to toe that line to what you think the public will allow. And he's at the end of the day,
yeah,
he's
yeah.
in he's
And
a
that's how he says it. The way he says it is like, you're when you're watching soccer, there's people playing the game, right? The only way to play that game is to actually be on the field.
Yes,
If
I
you're
love
not on the
that
field,
quote.
you're just an observer.
I love that quote about the whoever said about being in the arena. The glory is who's in the arena. And I forgot that quote. I wish I could put it up on the screen. I can't remember who the freaking said it. But anyway, we
Yeah,
can
I
keep
got you. I
going.
got you.
But yeah. So Alex, let's take some questions, man. So I want to go over some facts that you may or may not know. I think you especially know more about like the roots of Bitcoin a lot more than I do. I kind of appreciate from a hard asset perspective, economic sense.
Let
I
me tell
love
you right now
talking
that
to you.
if you think that that's the comparison, like I'm just that much more knowledgeable, I would say I'm only the halfway point, and that there are people that are just way more like they live this. Like I'm not a coder, right? I'm not
Mm-hmm.
a coder. I've never made like a bot. I don't really work with any algorithms or anything like that. Um, I'm not like a techie in the sense that I can go into any computer and you know I can't hack. I can't do a lot of things that you would think someone who really knows about Bitcoin would
Mm-hmm.
be doing. I really just think I'm knowledgeable, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I'm really that smart, maybe like average at best, right? Everything I know, I just learned by reading and by hearing people out. And, I have my own opinions, obviously, but I do rely a lot on um, facts, or interesting facts or just nuances of history. And I just use that to try to put everything together. I will say that I'm definitely an analytical thinker, so I see patterns usually
Mm-hmm.
that you might not see, and I might put two things that are totally not related and put them together and somehow make sense of it. Sometimes I do make sense, sometimes I don't. That's probably where I get most of my intuition and most of the stuff I say, some of
Fair
the
enough.
crap I say. I'm sure it rings true to a lot of people. I know that a lot of people who know more than me, they'll say, "Yeah, you're right, Alex." But the fact of the matter is that I got that information probably from them or their friends.
Okay, fair enough, man. That's awesome. And it's good, always good to have a dose of humility, right? Never hurts.
For sure,
I've
for
I've
sure,
always
for
been
sure.
really open to, oh, I don't know that, and it's okay. I know a guy who does. Division of labor, right? That's kind of
Yeah, for sure, for
same
sure.
sort of
Like
concept.
like I said, I believe that Bitcoin is not really affected by anything. But the people who know more than me, they would probably not answer like that. They probably have a better idea of what things probably do totally affect Bitcoin values, right? And the only reason that I kind of just stick to my belief is just because it's worked out. I make a prediction, the prediction comes true. Okay, whatever I'm thinking must be close enough. And if I'm wrong, then I'm going to have to adapt and change my mind. But
Are you
so far, that
making
hasn't.
predictions? You're making them on the longer term, right? So, like for me, I was playing devil's advocate, right? I would argue the trajectory, based off what I know, what I think, what we've talked about, all things you and I agree on, it's going to be up no matter what over the long term. So, like,
Sure, yeah, yeah, yeah.
I want you to kind of specify the predictions that you're making in a sense of are they time bound? Are you saying it's going to go up this to this fib level at this time, or and they put stop loss
So
here X
my
Y Z.
method is
Mm-hmm.
so simple,
Okay.
and I'll tell you what it is. But it's so simple. It's probably embarrassing. Okay, so just two main things.
Well, I actually have a chart pulled up. If you're comfortable, we can do it live. If you want to have it on the week time
Okay,
scale.
yeah,
Can,
that's fine. Go
can,
ahead and pull up
okay,
like the long chart,
that'd be
the
fun.
all-time chart.
Okay, let's do that. Oh man, I was so hoping you'd be cool with that. So
And by the way, I can't see your side.
oh, you can't. Okay. I'm not really sure how to. Okay. Well, I will figure out a way to share it. I'm gonna go ahead and put my I have it on the chart right now on
I
the
mean, I know
screen.
the method so well. I can just imagine it in my head and tell you exactly what I do. So it's not really a big deal.
I'm gonna share.
As
It's a
long
little
as
bit.
you can see the graph, that's all that matters.
That's okay. I'm gonna share the screen. You're gonna see it. People are gonna lose you for a second, but that's okay. So here we are, and you should be able to see the
Yeah, I
screen
see
now,
it. I
right?
see it now.
Okay. So I have it on the weekly. Um, it's
Put
nice
it
seeing
on
it
the
over
all
100,000.
time.
So help me out here, Alex. You want me to put it on 12 month is the longest I can go. Which is
Is that the longest you can go?
yeah. I mean, I tend if I'm looking at long term, I usually look
What do
at the
you have it
monthly,
on right now? Because
right?
that's all of it right there.
Oh no, you can see everything, but here's the monthly,
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
I had it on the weekly. I like seeing a little more granular when I'm looking at the long term, so I like going on the weekly, or the daily.
So all my forecasts
Hmm.
are all done by looking at the all time.
At the all time. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead
Now,
and I'm gonna get rid of
now,
all
if
the.
I was following it every day like I used to, I could do daily predictions for sure. Daily, weekly, sometimes even monthly predictions, depending on the season. Some seasons are a lot
Hmm.
harder to predict. I would say the hardest thing to predict are the dips, but I can usually predict the rises on point, and I'm pretty good. I can usually hit them within like the margin of error is probably roughly a week, maybe 4 or 5 days.
Hmm.
Um, and I got plenty of Facebook posts to back that up, and I got plenty of private discussions with friends and groups that go that too. But so if you'll pull up, do the whole thing,
All right.
and I'm gonna have you make lines just like what you're doing,
Okay. I'll get rid of these real quick. Or
and I'm
try
gonna
to get
have
rid
you
of them.
make a few lines. And this is just my one of my two methods. I'll tell you my second one in a minute.
Okay. All right. Here we go. So you want it? So the weekly is
Uh,
good, or you want the daily?
that's just how you have it right now, how
All
you
right.
have the graph, the way you have the graph, because that's showing all of it.
Yep. Showing all of it.
So make a line from the beginning to that first peak, which is somewhere around 1,000.
Okay. Give me a sec because I don't know what I just did here.
And if you can, just make it a full straight line that cuts through the graph.
Okay. So here's the. Sorry, I gotta reset here, Alex. All right. So here's a straight line, and just tell me where to put it.
So I want the line to start at the bottom,
Okay.
right?
That good?
And then have the line go through the first peak.
Okay.
Yep, just like that. All right. And then do another one,
All right.
but do it from the first peak to the second peak,
The second
the
peak,
20,000 peak.
all the way to the end.
Let it go all the way through, and let it go all the way through. Yeah, let it
Okay.
go all the way through. Now,
All
you
right.
see how it's going to hit the peak?
Okay.
This is how I determine my peaks, just my peaks. Now, another way I can do this is where you would draw a line from the beginning, but instead of drawing it through the peak, you would draw it through the the like the bottom of the first big dip after the 1,000, and then draw a line from the bottom of that dip to the bottom of the second dip.
So that would be, I guess, technically. I mean, technically it's right here, but I think what you
A
mean is
little
right here. I
higher.
think what
Yeah,
you mean is
right
right
there.
here,
Yep,
right? Yeah.
that's it. Yeah.
I gotcha. Okay.
Now, the peaks are really what matters. Those are the ones that you want to, that's obviously if you're trying to buy and sell, that's obviously where you want to sell, right? You want to sell at the peak, right? Um, and then the bottoms they're not easy to predict, and they don't flesh out like my peaks, but they always fit on this line.
So then
And
you have a point of confluence here, let's say over the next year or two, where it could reasonably go up to 120 and then just as reasonably.
it's going to hit at least probably like, all right, I'm thinking the least it'll hit is 115, and probably the most it'll hit is like 145. I'm looking at like a 130 peak for this cycle. That's where it would fall on that line. And then there's always the assumption that every peak has an 80% drop. And if you do the math, it's roughly 80%. I think the first one was like 81%. I think the second one was like 83%. I think one was 79%. They're all roughly 80%.
Mm-hmm.
So if we assume that we do get a peak at 130, you can kind of forecast when it'll hit that peak by using that line you drew,
Mm-hmm.
and then you can kind of guess what the next floor will be by just doing 80% of the top, but you can't predict when we'll hit that bottom. There may be a way to do it, but I've never been able to figure it out. Now, with all that said, um,
Okay.
this is literally how I've made all of my predictions.
So support and
My
resistance,
predictions have all
basically.
been they've all been valid, and so I had to make sense of this. Why is this stupid simple method working? And I've actually ran by this by by experts, and people have written papers on this. They're saying that the reason that you can just line this up like this is because it's operating on a power law. You probably heard this before. Are you familiar with that idea?
No, go into it a little bit, Alex.
So, like a power law, if when you're watching things grow naturally, whether it be like animals or groups of animals, societies, governments, companies, when things are successfully growing, they grow on a power law. You can measure this. If you Google power law, you'll see what I'm talking about. There's a couple papers written on this. There's a couple good articles. I think there's a good Substack article of a guy basically giving his whole argument on why this thing's operating on a power law, and it makes sense because the way I see Bitcoin is kind of like an organic, which things that operate on power laws are organic. They are natural things. They're usually not technological things, but they can certainly be things like a society or a government, which technically are not living things, but they are natural. They are organic. Um,
Okay.
there are plenty of
Interesting.
animals in the kingdom that have their own structures and hierarchies, right? So it's led me to believe that the reason that this works is because it's operating on a power law. I definitely have a lot more to learn about power laws, but my understanding of power laws is it's basically a measure of growth in organic, natural things. And when I say organic and natural, I don't mean like biological things. I mean things that are technically
Spontaneously occurring, like spontaneous order,
or
if you will.
alive. But again, when I
Okay.
say alive, I don't mean biological. So
Yeah.
spontaneous order definitely falls into this
Aligns
line
with
of
it a little
thinking
bit.
that
Okay.
I'm trying to
It's
bring
the
forward.
best I could think of to try to relate to what you're saying, I guess.
Yeah,
Was
and
that?
there's also that's another good one that got me. Spontaneous Order by Chase Rachels, I think it was.
Um,
I don't know if he's still an ANCAP, but he wrote a pretty good book called Spontaneous Order. Very good book. It also touches on this idea. It doesn't touch on the idea of power laws, but things that he says throughout the book are very reminiscent of power laws. I actually happen to think that he just didn't know about power laws, but if he did, he would have a lot to say about power laws in that book. But I believe that's what's going on there. Feel free to take that and try to use it to make forecasts or predictions. I basically just draw lines from between peaks,
mhm.
between bottoms, and some of that can only be done in hindsight. But when it comes to peaks, you're looking for a pattern, right?
Mhm.
So try to tie all the peaks together and see, hey, is there a pattern here? And I started doing that the first time it hit 1,000. I predicted roughly 17 or 18,000 based on that line that I did. And then I easily predicted the 69K. That was fairly easy. That was on the spot. And so I expect it to happen again. It's going to be around 130, something like that.
Okay.
It gets a little harder because as time passes, as you back up, the graph looks different, right? It doesn't look the same as if you're looking at the daily chart, the weekly chart, the monthly chart. As you back up, that's the only way you can make these lines and try to make those forecasts. And like I said, if it's on a power law, what's going on here is that I'm just looking far into the future. I'm making an assumption that this thing will run for a long time, and if it keeps running the way it's running for long enough, it's gonna hit certain numbers. That's why some people think it'll hit a million. Some people thought it would hit a million this cycle. Some people, and you know what?
Well,
I
market
think the
cap,
reason people thought that it would hit a million is because they thought it was an exponential thing, but it's not. A power law is not exponential, by the way. It's probably the opposite of exponential. Exponential means it'll keep growing in a way that's like multiple. I can't remember the word, but power laws are a little bit
exponential.
more tame. They kind of like are slowly growing, kind of like a developing child. Um,
I'm trying to like akin to
and
like
then
an
the and then
adoption
the other
curve,
and
or
then the other one, the other method, is just simple like uh, is it a puzzle? It's like a math puzzle. It's like so if uh, if the first three numbers are 1, 5, and 9, what's the next number?
it's somewhat like an interval.
Yeah, pretty
It's
much.
basically like
I'm
a
trying to think. There's a name for what I'm thinking of, but and I just do that with the
factorial. I
totals.
don't know. I think
So if the first total was 1,000, and then it was 19, almost 20,000, and then it was 69, almost 70,000, what's the next number?
I think from
It's roughly 130.
where Bitcoin's gonna hit on the long term in terms of like the millions, right? I think you probably and you know this. I'm sure it's just a question of market caps. Like, so what's the gold market cap? And if Bitcoin were to absorb gold, then I think it'd be like a $5 million Bitcoin, give or take. And then
And you know what you mentioned, like it eventually surpassing Bitcoin. I actually think that it'll make gold more valuable. Maybe it will surpass it, but it'll probably somehow make gold more valuable. I think all the hard metals are actually going to get way more valuable more over time.
okay,
I don't think we should put gold and silver in the same bucket as Bitcoin, obviously. But I also don't think we should consider one better or worse than the other. I think these are totally different animals and they have totally different use cases. Um, and that's a big thing with Bitcoin. A lot of people think it has no intrinsic
intrinsic
value,
value,
which
so
we've
called, right?
heard it a million times. And, that gets into the topic of subjective value theory and all that, or however you put it, theory of subjective value. I forget what people say these days anymore, but um, I always put it like this thing hasn't been hacked, right? It's running on an algorithm that was designed by the NSA, right? And the NSA that's a big alphabet. That's a big organization with capabilities that I mean they're probably listening to us right now, right? These guys designed an algorithm that basically does math, right? But that isn't the only algorithm they've made. They've made a whole bunch of different type of algorithms. They've made viruses. You probably heard of Stuxnet, right? If you haven't, by the way, that's a virus that was used to infect the Iranian nuclear power plant and basically shut that shit down.
Hmm.
I believe it was made I think it was made with between the NSA and the Israelis. I think they made it together, I believe. But these guys are powerful. They're making very powerful things, right? And this thing is so secure that the amount of money it would take to hack this thing, it's not even worth it. You'd not only go bankrupt, but even if you like the cost of hacking Bitcoin is more than what Bitcoin is currently worth right now, right? And it'll always be that case.
Because you'd
So
have to
that's
overtake
one.
like all the independent nodes. I mean, you'd have to have control of nodes that could
Yeah,
validate
yeah.
themselves and validate
A
the
fifty
hack.
percent, a 50% attack is a 51% attack is probably possible, but it's highly unlikely for a lot of different reasons, and it's also a lot harder with Bitcoin than it is for a lot of other
Yeah,
ones,
it's
right?
where the quantum computer argument comes into play, right? And then that's where I'm not knowledgeable enough to counter argue. Well, what could advance technologically where you could hack it
And
because
then not even that's an issue. Like I said earlier, we
yeah,
still
I
have
heard you say that.
power groups that you can apply on a classical computer. So my point with this is that this is just one area, at least
mhm.
one area, that we can all say this thing has. intrinsic value. It has security unlike anything on this planet. It has better security than any bank on the planet. It literally has the best possible security that like there's probably better security apparatuses, but they're for probably like some government secret. Maybe it's for those UAPs that are flying around. Who fucking knows? But Bitcoin itself is still very
Most
impressive.
secure
It's
network in the world.
probably the most impressive thing that we're publicly aware of, right?
And that's the whole decentralization sort of aspect that makes it powerful, where you can't attack. You there are many snakes' heads. You can't just kill the snake by the head. I guess.
Sure, yeah,
So I think
and
that's good.
it fits the whole the what do they call it? The trifecta, right? So you have security, you have transparency, and you have privacy. And some people might have three different ways to order that, or they might replace one of the words. But those are usually the three I use. And,
Yep.
for a lot of people, are really confused about the other two, transparency and privacy. A lot of people think that these two kind of negate each other or contradict, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I always have to explain that yes, it's transparent, unlike your bank, which is a good thing, by the way. I think if you don't
Absolutely.
trust your bank, that's a good thing, right? It's transparent. Absolutely, that's a good thing. It should be considered a good thing. And if you don't trust your bank, it should definitely be considered a good thing, especially if you want to know what's happening to your money, what the bank's doing with your money, how they're investing it, what they're not doing with your money, because maybe you are trying to get them to invest it and they're not doing their job. Who knows? And then well, how the hell is it private if it's transparent? If I can see through it, how the hell is it private? And
Anonymity,
a lot of people don't
insofar as you don't
understand how
share
the
your account.
right. A lot of people
Yeah.
don't understand how the addresses work. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you're not going to know my address unless me and
I
you
tell you
make a transaction,
exactly.
which I'm only going to do a transaction with you if I trust you, right?
And even
Now,
then,
of
let's say if you
course,
don't trust me, what can you do? Create a new address.
sure,
Boom.
sure, sure,
Yeah.
and but that might be a little tedious for some people. So once we start talking about this topic, then people will start coming up with some really good counters, which makes sense. Well, I don't want to make a whole bunch of addresses. That's just too much. Or um, I don't want to use tumblers. I don't know if you know what a tumbler is. Basically, you throw in your crypto and it
Mm-hmm.
randomly spits back out some other ones, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and maybe the problem isn't trust. Maybe you're not. Maybe like so. Let's say I trust you, right? But maybe that's not enough because maybe the person I trust is compromised, right? Well, we have other things. Bitcoin isn't the only thing. We have Monero, right? We have no knowledge coins or no
Solve
knowledge
different kinds of
proofs.
problems.
Sorry,
And, and Bitcoin
or
doesn't have to be the all be all end all solution to every problem. Like I and for your point, Monero is much more private,
it brings
and
us into
or
a world
anonymous,
into a
trustless.
trustless institution. A
Exactly.
lot of people don't. You say trustless, that might sound like a bad thing to a lot of people. Like I want trust,
It's
right? Well,
it, it
no, the
speaks to the
idea
nature
that
of
you
there
don't
being a
need,
custodian between you and your assets that you're
right?
trusting. Which people don't
But this
understand either.
the
I didn't
context
understand
is
either
that
for
you don't
until a
need
couple years
trust.
ago. Sorry, Alex. I didn't mean to
No,
step all
you're
over you.
good. You're good. But like that's the thing. Like people don't think they're like, I want something on trust. Well, what about if we don't even need trust? What
Well,
if
what
this
about the
is
FDIC? FDI, I trust the FDIC to get my
and, and,
250,000.
and that's the kind of trust people want. Like, what is it backed by? And we'll get back to that in a moment. As a matter of fact, I'll just say it now. I think it's backed by these three things. It's backed by security. It's backed by this thing that's transparent, and it's private if you want to be. And if you really want to be private, yeah, you're gonna have to take some extra steps. But that's true regardless.
Agreed.
That's true regardless, whatever the context is, whatever topic we're discussing.
Mm-hmm.
If you're trying to be private, you're going to have to do some
Something
things,
different.
right?
Whether
You're
it's
going to have
using
to, and
cash or hoarding
in the
cash.
case of Bitcoin, do
What
what?
I mean, the only thing I can think of outside of a close medium to Bitcoin would be like cash. But
Sure,
cash,
sure, but
but you're
even cash,
you're
they can
diluting your
they can
money
use
every
your
year.
fingerprints and stuff. They can
Well,
use your
that's
DNA
actually
and stuff like
that's a
that.
really
So
good
even
point.
so even cash
That's
has
a
its
really
downsides, right?
that's a really good point. Yeah.
Although it's going to be a lot harder to track my DNA on a dollar. It probably has billions of other people's touched it, but
True. True.
a lot of people don't think in terms of like, well, how about if the system is built in a way that you don't even need to trust me, right? And then the best part about this is that I don't need to sell you on a different cryptocurrency, or rather, I can just sell you on another one. And by that I mean you can use these together. You can use Bitcoin with Monero.
Yep.
This is like a layer of defense.
Mm-hmm.
And when we talk about layers, we could talk about onions. Onions have layers,
Like Shrek.
and we could talk about using a Tor browser, using a VPN, using Tails on top of Monero, on top of tumblers. If you want to be private, it's easy. We have a lot of ways to do that. I can say it publicly. The feds could be right here next to me. They can know what I'm doing, but when I do it, there's nothing they can do about it. Like I've had a laptop that was confiscated by the authorities, and they returned it broken because they couldn't fucking get into it. And when I got into it, I can see what they did. I can see what they tried to do. I can see they tried to identify some certain things, and they couldn't do it because I used layers, several layers, to the point that it was very obvious to them that I was probably doing something sketchy, but that there's nothing they can do about it. And that's the world you kind of want to live in. Like if you're a good person who just wants to be private, this is a way to do it. And then if they come knock on the door asking why you're
You
being
know,
so
I want
private,
to retrace
you have to
back,
explain
man,
it
because
to them.
like I'm pretty sure just by talking to you, you weren't doing something sketchy that would violate the liberty of someone else. Probably weren't doing harm to someone else. Probably weren't stealing from someone else. Pretty sure you were just trying to live your life, and whatever sketchy thing you were doing, it was only sketchy insofar as what the law is concerned. And I think that's by virtue of that, I don't think it's sketchy at all. So just trying to give you some credit, I guess, Alex.
I got you. I got you. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean,
So
that does actually make me think about like the reputation of Bitcoin. It's obviously a lot better now than it started off. However, it isn't like it didn't deserve the bad reputation that it had at first. At
but
first,
why would you
it
say that?
really
Is it because
was.
of the Silk Road? Because of the, like I mean, I don't defend
Yeah.
like and you'll bear with me here, but I don't defend necessarily like say drug use or whatever. I don't use
Uh-huh.
drugs, right? That's a
Uh-huh.
personal choice. But,
Right.
I can eat like a whole pizza. So, I like whiskey. So pick your poison, right? So, like, I don't
Yeah.
pretend
Yeah.
to be better than anyone else. Now, naturally, dude, if you're under the influence and you hurt anyone, if you're drunk or whether you're, I don't know, on shrooms and you have a schizophrenic attack and hurt someone, like, it's all the same result at the end of the day. Restricting, being morally judgmental along these lines, I think is you're probably doing something equally reprehensible in someone else's eyes. So I try not to play that game.
Maybe.
Maybe, but I
So like,
go ahead.
there's drugs. People don't like. Some people don't like drugs. People don't like what it does to people, and how it can destroy lives,
Oh,
and how
absolutely.
if
I'm not defending.
things
Yeah,
are done
absolutely,
carelessly, you can die. And
absolutely.
when those two kids, I think they were teens from Australia,
What two
they
kids?
died on MDMA,
What's that?
some really good MDMA that
What is MDMA?
obviously
I'm sorry. What's
do what?
MDMA? What is MDMA? I don't know what
Oh,
that
sorry.
is.
Ecstasy.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
Ecstasy
you can tell
is
I'm
how
way
you
out of
would
the loop.
understand it.
Sorry.
Ecstasy.
Gotcha.
So this is a phenylphyltryptamine. It's just a chemistry term for what it's made of,
Okay.
and it works a lot like a psychedelic. It works a lot like a mix of like Adderall and say LSD, kind of like a mix. It'll give you this energy, right? Like an Adderall might, right? And then it'll also give you, I mean, some people hallucinate on this stuff,
Hmm.
but it'll give you kind of like a cerebral mental. I don't want to get too much into it. I'm not trying to convince you to do drugs or anything, but
No.
this drug is a powerful drug. We used to use it in the 50s and 60s for couples counseling,
Hmm.
um, in relatively low doses compared to what it is today. To put it bluntly, it's a dopamine and serotonin flush, which means that you're using most, if not all, the dopamine and serotonin in your brain. Dopamine is essentially what makes you feel happy.
Happy. Yeah. Yeah.
Serotonin is usually
The
what makes
question,
you
the only
dreamy.
question I care about is, would you restrict someone from using it under their own? Obviously you're an ANCAP, but I think the answer is no. But
Well, so I
but
mean,
would you?
let me answer this question by finishing this.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
like I said, it's a rush. It's a flush. It flushes some parts of your brain chemistry out there. And when I say a flush, I mean that it uses it all, kind of like you're flushing the toilet, right?
Okay.
Except instead of the toilet filling back up, it's gone, and it slowly refills over time,
All right.
right?
Okay.
So when you get rid of all the dopamine and serotonin in your brain, if you were to use MDMA in high doses more than more than once or twice within the span of a week, even a month, you will be very depressed. You don't have any dopamine. You literally can't help but feel depressed. And people who are addicted to stuff will usually, they'll do the suicide. They're so depressed they don't want to feel like this anymore. And they probably shot their, they probably did something to their brain, or they probably didn't wait long enough to recover. They could have probably just gone to Walmart and bought 5-HTP. A lot of people use this stuff to recover. It's just a basic vitamin you can buy at Walmart. It's like not even
Hmm.
over the counter or anything like that. You don't need a prescription for it. I mean, people use this to recover from tripping or rolling, as you will. But this, I'm talking about adults, right? In the
Okay.
50s and 60s, we used it for a couple of counting. It was like maybe 50, 60 milligrams. A dopamine flush means you're using all the dopamine. It means you feel really good. It's like, if you want to know what love is, what love feels like, it makes you feel love. It's almost hard to be anything but kind and generous when you're on MDMA. You almost can't. If you've ever taken MDMA and you were mad, you didn't take MDMA. You probably took something else, right? So it was really good for couples counseling, right? And that's why people use it, because it makes them feel good. It also gives them energy. So I use it for partying. But today, in our designer drug era, this stuff has like, it's like 350 milligrams. Between 200 and 300 milligrams, which is a lot. All right, 40, 50, 50, 60 milligrams is a lot. We used to use it for couples counseling, for like psychiatry, right? So imagine
Okay.
taking triple, quadruple the dose, right? And in a full grown adult, taking just more than one or two of these within a week span can end up being depressed for long enough to make them want to die, right?
Okay.
So these kids in Australia got some. They got some Bitcoin. They ordered some high quality MDMA, and they died. They probably dehydrated. They probably didn't drink water, and honestly, their body probably couldn't handle it. It was probably such a fucking rush. They probably had a heart attack or something, on top of probably not hydrating enough. So, with that said, there's definitely a danger and a threat when it comes to drugs. Do I think we should like restrict people from doing any of that or stop people from anyone? I want to be. I don't want to like just straight up be like I'm an anarchist. No, period. No, I definitely. I don't actually think many actually. I don't think any anarchists actually really think like that. At least I think at the very least people are like, well, no, we can't give them the kids, obviously, right? But that's actually a good starting point. That would have to. This is for another time, but that should make us think about age, why age matters, why the development of your brain and body matters, why how that's affected, how the drugs you use affect that, and vice versa. A 15-year-old is not going to handle a psychedelic trip like a 25-year-old. A teenager might freak the fuck out, and really an adult might too if you're not about that life, if you know what I mean. If you're not about that life, if you're just an innocent person who decided to trip for whatever reason, you're probably gonna freak the fuck out and think you saw a devil. And who knows? Maybe you will lose your mind. There are not that many cases of that, but there are instances of that happening. It probably has more to do with their genetic predispositions. Maybe they had schizophrenia or in their family, or maybe some sort of schizoaffective disorder or what have you. But anything happen. You can't really predict it. I think when it comes to drug use, you should be informed. It should be just like any other medicine, drug, whatever, legal or not. I think all of it should be like that. I think food should be like that. I think people should be informed about sugar or HDL and LDL, cholesterol.
But would you
I
would you
think
restrict them from eating sugar? It's the same kind of concept. As
so. So
the
that's the thing. I wouldn't. I would rather focus on informing than restricting. Like if this 15-year-old kid is informed, then who am I to restrict it? But also, can a 15-year-old even like comprehend what
Probably
I'm
not.
telling them in my informing? Like
Probably
it's
not.
like the story of Prometheus who stole the fire from the gods and handed them, handed it to the
And stuck to
humans,
a rock
right?
the
And
rest
what
of
did we do with that
his
fire? We
existence.
fucking destroyed each other with it. We killed each other. They had to send down Pandora in her box, and she screwed that up too. She opened the box, and all this terrible shit came out. She closed the box, and she left one thing in the box. It was the one thing we needed: hope, right? It's also the same story of Lucifer. Same exact story. He stole the light instead of the fire from God. He gave it to us. And what did we do with it? The light is knowledge. What do we do with the knowledge? We use the knowledge to kill each other. So the lesson I take from that is that you can't try to teach someone something, you can't try to inform someone something, and expect them to take the message that you're trying to give them.
Right, right.
So
I
I
would agree
think
with that.
people should be informed instead of restricted. Like, what's the point of restricting someone who doesn't know? Maybe we should restrict people who don't know, but at what point are you going to let them know? And at what point are they going to be able to like actually take in this information and make sound judgment? Like, can I trust a 15-year-old with this information? It's like, dealing with kids. You can't just tell kids the truth because they'll run who knows with that information. You have no clue. And really, it's not much different with teenagers. And frankly, it's not even that much different with young adults.
Yeah.
I think, we're obviously still developing well into our late 20s as a young 20-year-old
I feel like I'm still
compared to
developing.
who I am now. Do what?
Honestly, I feel like I'm still developing, and I'm past my 20s.
For sure. Yeah, yeah, no, for sure. I've totally finally embraced, years ago that learning is a lifelong process, and I'm always going to be this idiot that I think I am. I'm always going to be ignorant of something, no
You're always
matter
gonna look
what.
back and
Even the
think,
things that I
man.
think I'm an expert in, I'm going to be ignorant in something there.
Yep.
There's going to be something that I either didn't know, was too arrogant to take in, or just things we haven't even discovered yet.
Yep.
So I try to take all that into consideration when it comes to drug use and kids, teenagers using drugs. I started using drugs as a teenager, although all of us are different. Some people probably like I have friends who did started say smoking pot around the same time I did,
Mm-hmm.
and that probably was not. It was probably the worst thing for them, and for others, it was great. It was
It's
great. I
interesting
actually have
how
a
some
friend
people are
who's
really productive in spite of that, let's say, habit, if we can call it that. You know,
I was gonna say one of my best friends. His parents were like, "You could smoke pot if you have if you keep your 4.0," and he used that as motivation to smoke pot. He's like, "Okay, all I have to do is have a 4.0 and I can
mm-hmm.
smoke my pot." So for him, it made him productive. It
Mm-hmm.
made him super productive. So for him,
I
it
got
was really
nothing
good. But
against it
for
except that
others,
it
I can't
smells
say
like
the same.
ass. Besides that, I don't have anything against
Sure,
pot.
sure. It's an acquired smell.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I've been reading the questions that we were supposed to ask ourselves, Alex. I've loved the conversation so far, man. We have actually answered just about every single one of them. I'm gonna read them off to you
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for
here
sure,
in
for sure.
kind of in closing here relatively soon, and
I do try to tie it all together. I almost can't help it. That's just like
oh no,
my
dude, no, don't worry,
analytical
dude. Oh,
mind.
oh no, it's great. It's just,
If it's any consolation, I didn't know I had an analytical mind until like probably a few months ago. I actually figured that out through GPT, believe it or not.
okay. I
I
love
saw a
ChatGPT,
uh,
man.
I saw a meme of a graph, and I made assumptions about the graph. I thought it had something to do with statistics because it reminded me of a normal distribution curve,
Okay.
and I realized that I was being stupid. So I showed GPT the picture and I told GPT my thought process. And
Mm-hmm.
I was like, GPT, what the hell am I doing? Why did I think this? And it laid out and described like literally the person I am, like the way I think, like the way I logic. And I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. Like no shit, I see patterns that may or may not make sense. No wonder I put things that are unrelated together. Like I can see how that probably helped me with Bitcoin. In hindsight, I think that's why I'm able to make the predictions or forecasts that I make. It's probably the reason why I do that line and I think, okay, this works. This should work. When maybe it's just a coincidence, right? Um, so I like to credit being an analytical person for that, but It's not like I'm trying to do that. I can't help it. It's just the way I think. I think everyone's got their own sort of way of thinking, and they all have flaws and they all have benefits. Obviously,
Agreed.
there's some flaws to analytical thinking that can make me seem schizophrenic. Like trying to make sense of things that clearly don't. They probably don't make sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there's also like the benefits of like, okay, well, I'm seeing this pattern and it's paying off really well.
Fair enough. So one of the questions that we were supposed to ask ourselves, and we've already addressed, I think, I'll just read them off. Bitcoin is often described as sound money. Compared to fiat currencies backed by central banks, from your perspective, what makes Bitcoin a superior alternative, and how do you see its adoption impacting the Federal Reserve's monetary policy over the long term? We've already agreed they're going to buy Bitcoin, so I think that's pretty
Yeah,
much it. As a,
I did answer that question too, for sure.
one critique of
Um,
Bitcoin from an Austrian economics standpoint is its fixed supply and lack of elasticity, which some argue could lead to deflationary pressures. Do you see this as a challenge to its viability as a global currency, or is this characteristic of a strength in the context of economic freedom?
right.
I think.
Well, yeah,
Oh, go ahead.
actually, you didn't really. I
Go ahead.
touched on. I mentioned deflationary stuff, right? I
Mm-hmm.
didn't really answer that second question. I did
Mm-hmm.
set myself up for it though. So first off, Economics. The main thing, like the main affinity here, is um, a mistrust of centralized intervention, specifically intervention. It almost doesn't even really matter what the intervention is. It just so happens that most of the interventions were from the state or some sort of centralized figure like the Fed, right?
An authoritarian,
Um,
contextually speaking, figure, I would argue, but I think I can concede to that definition. I could. Mm-hmm.
okay, and then since Bitcoin is fixed, it has a sort of deflationary pressure,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of people wonder about this. Is like, is
Relative
this
to
a
the
good
U.S.
thing
dollar,
or a
right?
bad
Relative
thing?
to fiat, you mean, right,
Yeah,
Alex?
exactly,
Copy.
right.
Mm-hmm.
And I always consider this like people question whether or not it's a good or bad thing because they think it might be like an artifact or like a bug or something. Although I'm pretty convinced that it's not a bug, that it's definitely more of a feature, and that deflation in this context, anyway, is it's not a destructive force that Keynes would paint it to be.
It's not quote unquote
It's more of a
destabilizing.
yeah.
Okay.
I would say it's more of a reflection of increasing productivity
Mm-hmm.
and technological advancement. And I think it's obvious. Like blockchain that's new tech. Well, relatively new now. It's been out for a while now, right? But at the time, it was totally new. And I don't think people really caught on to the fact that not only is it new, but it's extremely useful, and not just in the context of currency and money. Like I see a future of voting on a blockchain. I
Yeah.
think that's an obvious thing that
Trustless.
will happen. I think that's inevitable, and I can't even imagine a good argument against that not happening for any reason. So it's a reflection of productivity and technological investment, where prices can naturally fall
Mm-hmm.
as goods become cheaper,
I want to talk about. I want
cheaper to produce, anyways.
you hit a chord with me, man. The voting thing. I think, and maybe I could be wrong, but I think if people are trusting the blockchain, a trustless system, let's say, for voting, I would almost argue at that point we're much closer to a free society, right?
For sure.
If there's enough people that have, if it's politically popular for that to be a thing, then that has
Yeah.
to mean that people in general are already rejecting the authoritarian sort of nature of what we have now and wanting more liberty, more freedom,
I
more
hope so. Although
decentralized
right now I
future.
think most people are just in it for the money.
Yeah, yeah, very much. I hate to use this cliche term because I feel like it's so freaking overused and by people that I don't necessarily agree with from a status perspective. But like, it's very much in the matrix, very plugged in, and it's true. I really feel like you're. I very much can relate to Neo in terms of like waking up and like, holy cow, man, I've been wrong, and like getting flushed, and
Yeah.
like it's not actually like you would think it'd be a very nice experience and almost like a, but it's kind of like, yeah, it is kind of man, it's kind of like disturbing, and you're like, man, and then like, how am I gonna, there goes my video again, convince all these people, right? So because then you become kind of
Yeah. Yeah.
passionate,
Yeah.
right? And you want to tell everybody about it, and then you realize not everybody's ready to freaking like hear what you have to say. Not everybody really
Right. Right. Right.
cares,
Right. But
and that
also,
was really frustrating.
in even when they are ready to hear you out, they're just in it for the money. And when you tell them like, hey man, it's not about the money, they're like, then I don't care. Or like, listen, I don't want to hear that. Just tell me how to make this work so I can make money from it. And like, I don't care. I'm like, sure, okay, I'll tell you what I
Mm.
think, and you can go make your bets or whatever, and
Do you
you
ever
can try to
suggest
make your money or
DCAing,
whatever.
Alex, or do you typically do the kind of like your
Dollar cost averaging.
yeah, sorry, yeah, for those who don't, dollar
I
cost
believe
averaging.
DCA is the way. That's pretty
Fair enough.
much
Me too.
all I've done since 2015, 2016. Roughly a year or two after I stopped trading, I started just DCA. I mostly just use Strike, the Strike app,
Okay.
and only because I can't find. I have found others, but they're not as intuitive or as simple as this one. They also don't let you go as low as this one, but you can buy as low as 50 cents an hour, right? So I buy 50 cents an hour. It's $12 a day,
Mm-hmm.
every hour, every day, using Strike. I've automated that. It's been automated since 2015, 2016.
That's amazing, dude. That's
And,
amazing.
and anyone can do that. Maybe not $12 a day. I know that adds up. I know that not anyone can do that. I mean, honestly, there's been some times where I actually had to shut it off for a couple of weeks
You
because
put
I
it on
needed
cold
I needed
storage
those twelve
afterwards, or
dollars.
do you keep you? I'm assuming
Um,
you move it to like a Trezor or something, or a cold wallet, or do you keep it just on?
so everything through Strike is on a nano ledger. However, that's like minimal of my holdings. I actually set up a Bitcoin and an Ethereum IRA several years ago.
I trust capital.
It's been man, it's been 7, 8 years now. I think
Mm-hmm.
I already went through one side. I did a 5 year at first, and then after the 5 years were over, I went ahead and just do it again. And no, I've actually got a friend. He's a CPA, and he's actually I forced him into the journey. I forced him to learn about this technology, and I told him exactly what my vision was, what I wanted to do with it, and how I wanted him to deal with it. So he's pretty much like my custodian, and I actually don't know what he does as of 2 years ago, because 2 years ago I pretty much gave him the go to trade as he wishes because I knew I had enough to put on the side that I have to worry about, and I knew I can give him enough to play with so that he can learn and figure things out that I don't know yet.
Mm-hmm.
We meet up like every 2.5 years and go over what either of us have learned. But basically, I let him, he's a stock trader. He knows stocks very well. Stock traders probably have an upper hand in the crypto industry because even though Bitcoin is not a stock, it sure as hell behaves like one,
Oh
and it
yeah,
behaves like one
it's,
because people put money into stocks
it's
just like they put money into Bitcoin.
pegged
So
to the
it's
S
really
and P. I
it's
mean,
not it's not that they're stocks, that it's not that they're like stocks. It's that the things that make them run are humans, and humans behave in a certain way when it comes to money. So
I gotcha.
um, and I've relayed all this kind of stuff to him, um, and he's like he like sees things that I describe, and he's got a word for it that exists within stock trading in that whole industry. Like you know what a candlelight is?
I know what a candlestick is.
Yeah, you know what a candlestick is, right?
Yeah.
So I didn't know what the fucking candlestick is, right?
Okay.
And I was telling him, I was going through the process of telling him how I was going to predict like the next couple weeks based off of a candlestick, but I didn't know that. He was like, "Oh, it's a candlestick," and I'm like, "What the fuck is that?" And he's like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah. When a stock value does this, la di da. You can make some inferences, and they're usually you can make some fairly safe assumptions usually, depending on how long the stock has been around and what behavior's been around. And
Are you referring to like
there's a whole bunch of them.
bullish pin bars and like those sort of
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of them. Yeah, there's
patterns?
hundreds of them. There's hundreds of
Yeah.
them, and he knows all of them by
Okay.
heart. And he was able to like go through my analysis and put words to like my descriptions. It's like someone looking at animals in a zoo for the first time and not knowing the names of any of the animals, and they're walking around on the phone talking to their friend describing the animals, and their friend's like, oh yeah, you're looking at a zebra, you're looking at a monkey, you're like,
Mm.
he's pretty much an expert in my eyes, right? Except in this case it's like you're talking to someone who actually works with animals, because an actual professional stock trader. So he had an upper hand, and he was able to like correct some of my predictions, like my short-term predictions. Anyways, he's let me put it this way: I'm all long-term. I just have I just see things years in advance. He's a very short-term person, so he would be a lot better like day trading and weekly trading than I would be. Like today, I would suck at it. In the early days, it was a lot easier because Bitcoin was just not making that much of a, it wasn't making these $1,000 swings, right? And
Mm.
also, what now we're at the point where there's so much risk in day trading Bitcoin now, because you can literally lose like, go for, if you buy, let's say you buy a whole Bitcoin at 80,000 and it goes down to 75,000. That's not really a big dip, but that is a $5,000 loss, right?
Mm.
So like the risk is much bigger at the bigger numbers. So I don't take those risks anymore, but he can take those risks like it's nothing all day, every day. He can trade, and I trust him with it all day. I would highly recommend. You said who you use trust
I trust
for
capital
Bitcoin and Ethereum?
for an IRA. That's
Yeah,
probably the most popular one.
I knew they have a Bitcoin IRA. Do they have an Ethereum IRA?
I don't think so, but I believe you can pick Ethereum as an asset in the I Trust Capital portfolio.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
I don't quote me
that's
on
pretty
that,
much
but
the route I took. So I'm a long
yeah.
holder through Bitcoin, Ethereum, IRA. I do have like some on the side Bitcoin that I buy through, that I DCA through Strike since like 2015 or so,
Hmm.
and then I have a whole bunch of altcoins that I hold in several different wallets. And the Bitcoin is all on a Nano Ledger. At least every other month I put on a Nano Ledger, and then everything else I actually keep them on app wallets. It depends on which crypto it is. Like for example, I hold some ADA,
Okay.
Cardano,
I feel
and
like
I use
Cardano's always at
Yoroi.
like 46 cents. Any any time I've ever looked at it, it's like 46 cents or
Are you familiar with Yoroi? Yaroi.
no, no, not.
So if you download Yoroi, this is basically like a network or ecosystem for ADA. It gives you access to hundreds, probably thousands of pools that you can delegate tokens to. You can throw in like 100 ADA in there, and then you get like um, you gain interest on it. You get
Yeah, it's like
rewarded
staking.
every time there's a cycle. You'll get some back, and you can claim it. So you can turn your 100 ADA to 2, 3,
Yep,
400 ADA,
yep.
whatever's worth. So
Like the whole. I think that's referred to as staking. I believe, if I'm correct.
yeah, staking.
Staking.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So
And just to give you an idea, see now, right now, you're on my level. I don't know more than you. You literally know the terms better than I do.
I've
Just to give
definitely
you an idea.
I'm pretty like I've actually like learned a little bit about technical analysis, and I could actually like draw you up a chart. And so a lot of what you're talking about in terms of how you see the charts, you look a lot of at a lot of kind of in a sense you were looking at like demand line, supply line trajectory, and seeing where the points of confluence are, but also probably like a lot of supply support and resistance sort of analysis, which is
Yes,
typically the
yes,
more
yes, yes, yes.
it's the more I don't want to say robust. It's the more oh my god, the more reliable is using that. And I like fib retracements and using
Is it
fibs
more
for
reliable?
using support and analysis, support and resistance. Absolutely, yeah, it is. In terms of
Interesting. Yeah,
because you have history.
that's basically how I operate.
Yeah.
I like to try to predict floors, which is and then which is like the opposite of the resistance, right? You're trying to predict what the lowest it'll go this week, this month,
Mm-hmm.
this year, whatever. Um, and like I said, those are kind of hard to predict for me. I can tell you that it'll go 80% off the top. That's all. When it comes to resistance, though, I think that's always been more obvious because it'll do this number for like whole year and a half, very volatile, I guess you can say. Although in the long run, it's just a fucking line, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there are times where it's kind of just like a wave, and it'll do that for several months,
Yep.
and you'll know within
Trading sideways.
days, maybe a week at most, what the top and bottom is, and that's when it's time to start trading, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, when we're going through bull runs, I think it's just kind of obvious that you probably shouldn't time this. I don't think you could time it because, like I said, I think it's organic. I don't think you can rely on the news. You can rely on FOMO though. I love looking at Facebook and seeing all of a sudden all these people talking about it. I know I do not need to buy right now, right? And then when people start saying that it's too high, when a lot of them start saying too high, I already know people are selling right now. It's going to drop at least a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good time to buy, obviously.
Yep.
But that's I think that's kind of basics. That's like stocks basics, right? That's
Yeah.
stock market trading basics, and that's why I said like the stock traders have an upper hand because they understand that kind of behavior better than
Yeah. And the whole idea of
some guy who's just looking at cryptocurrency for the first time and has never touched stocks. Which, by the way, I'm that guy.
yeah, I bought Bitcoin before I ever bought a stock as well. So yeah, of course I was when I first bought Bitcoin, it was on Robinhood. Now I have a Tether, and I just try not to look at what I have
And then
really.
before we end the tangent, on the voting thing, I want to say that like so what we're really aiming for is democracy. That's the ideal, anyways, right? I'm not sure where, but you can mathematically prove that the way that our
Sorry.
democracy is set up, um, it's not really a democracy. Like it mathematically, it doesn't work. Like mathematically, it'll never it'll never be like no matter how many parties you have, it will usually end up to two. Like this is the fact that we have two parties is kind of like an organic result of a very inorganic way of doing what we call democracy.
Mm-hmm.
I think that issue could easily be solved through blockchain voting for several reasons, but it also would require us to rethink representatives and how representatives operate and whether or not we should be even voting through representatives. And I think probably our next step, I don't think this is like the end goal or solution, but I think the next solution we will probably use either in tandem with blockchain technology or before we get blockchain technology is ranked choice voting. And I think that'll innovative, inevitably lead to blockchain voting because if you have ranked choice voting and we've all agreed that this is probably the best way to go about it, then the next step is to make sure that no one can cheat. And you can't really cheat with a very transparent blockchain that you can audit. And instead of currency, we're talking in terms of voting. I think it's very obvious that blockchain is the next step in that, whether we're doing ranked choice voting in the future or not
Yeah.
regardless.
In terms of
Um,
voting or solutions to voting, I think that so I'm pretty indifferent on this just because I see democracy working at a very micro level. So how
yeah,
those people decide to vote, if they don't like it, they can go down the street. So like my idea, as much as I despise my HOA with every ounce of my being, I've even considered making a separate channel where I go like where I literally am defaming my HOA. I'm not even kidding. I'm still considering that, dude. But as much as I despise it, I consented to live here. So my basic philosophy on life, right? The way I break down what is in Capistan, what is the philosophy of anarcho-capitalism or even of libertarian, it's respecting consent as the meta ethic that organizes society. That really
Sure.
is what it boils down to. At the end of the day, what is capitalism? Right? It's mutual consent, trading, whatever. It's so when you have a group of people that want to impose on that by force, you want to make sure that it's at the most local level possible. Obviously, if we and and we can get into this if you want to, but what would happen if we have anarchy tomorrow? Well, you'd have tribes that form, and they would come up with their own rules, right? So anarchy is not no rules; it's no rulers, right? So my
I mean,
idea
that's what
is
we have now, though, right? We already have tribes.
we have tribes, but the problem is that we have, and you might argue that the progression of what you know. Here's the difference. So I've gone through this brain like mind experiment a lot. So we have anarchy tomorrow, we have tribes, and we have basically what I would call like akin to HOAs. We'd have like very very micro local governments that represent the people as closely as you possibly can. We would deter war and conflict by through economic trade, because that's what trade does, and I think you would probably agree with that. And we wouldn't have necessarily like of course this is in a silo, so forget that there's a border and that we've pissed people off somewhere across the ocean, and that there might be some
Mhm.
real risk of, let's say, people coming over and killing us. And then this is academic in a sense, and I always tell people it's not that it's academic, that it wouldn't, that's just theoretical. No, this would work, but there's externalities that exist now that would impose on that working, assuming that things were peaceful, let's say, from the beginning. So what we want to do pragmatically, in my view, and what I talk about this channel, is like we want to get as close to that as possible. When we're talking about voting and why I'm indifferent to the means by which we vote, it's because I kind of think these things are can, and let's say that that is the best way, ranked choice voting or whatever that even is, that whatever, fine. As long as you consent to that mode, by virtue of you living in that community, and we don't have like a larger central government, like the smallest possible government that you subscribe to, right? That you can reasonably leave and go live somewhere else if you don't like it. That is what I kind of ultimately like care about, and I don't know if that makes sense to you, but that's more or less kind of where I see what is the right amount of government, and because I think it's a lie to presume that the moment you have anarchy and you have a tribe that you could say, well, that's anarchy. Well, it's a form of government by virtue of people consenting to some basic rules. So it's not that
Mhm.
anarchists are against government. It's that we want as much consent as possible to be injected into
Right, right,
where
right,
what
right.
organization or what group we live within, I guess. So I don't know, what do you think about that?
Yeah.
I've thought about that at length, and that's where I'm at right now in my journey. That's about as far as I can
I
go.
was going to mention ranked choice voting. So, like, under what we have right now is, uh, I don't think this is rhetoric, but I think literally mob rule, majority rule, right?
Mm-hmm.
Ranked choice voting would be like you would vote for the person you're voting, and then you would vote what your second choice would be, and
Okay.
what your third choice would be, and so on.
All right.
And this comes into play when, let's say, there's ties, or maybe your candidate is no longer in the race.
Like
It
recently.
fixes it
Okay.
fix it fixes a couple few problems. You should definitely take a look at it. Do some research on it. It's actually an interesting idea. I don't know if I'm totally for it, but I do know that I prefer that over what we have now, just because of math. Literally, just because of math. Just math alone just makes that more fair and honest than what we
In
have
terms
right
of
now.
the electoral college, or in terms of just pure populism, or like I'm trying to get a
Both,
reference.
both.
Okay.
Yeah, I
So
would definitely check that out.
I'd have to look into, yeah, see the
Yeah,
mechanics of
yeah,
it,
yeah,
but
yeah.
it's interesting. I've never heard of it,
Um,
so I mean, I'm definitely gonna look at it now because I have to. It's gonna bother me
yeah,
at
I
night.
just found out about it probably about a year ago. I want to say about a year ago. Um,
It sounds like
yeah,
something.
roughly a year
Don't
ago.
be offended by this, Alex. It sounds like something I would hear like on Vox or something. if you if you'll
Dude, Vox probably was the first one to talk about this stuff. Yeah,
probably,
yeah, for sure.
fair
You
enough.
you probably would have heard it from Vox. It wouldn't surprise me.
Fair enough. I try to stay
I
out.
think I heard it from a liberal podcaster. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
It wasn't a bad idea. It wasn't a bad
I'll look
idea.
at it.
But
I have to now, man.
oh,
I have to.
but back to deflationary. So like um, I left off. So I was saying that it's a reflection of increasing productivity and technological advancement.
Hmm.
The deflation, anyways, right? And and really, it's to the point where prices can naturally fall as goods become cheaper, or rather, cheaper
More,
to produce,
more plentiful.
right? Now, as a behaviorist, and this is always going to affect the way I view things because
Mm.
I really adore the way behaviors view things.
Mm.
Um, I would view deflationary dynamics as altering the reinforcement schedules associated with holding
Okay.
versus spending money.
So your time
So
horizon for satisfaction. Yeah.
instead of a forced use it or lose it, which is what's going on with the dollar. You know, your dollar is losing value every single fucking
Mm-hmm.
day. So today is the best time to spend your money because
Mm-hmm.
it's worth more today than it's going to be tomorrow, right? So instead of a forced use it or lose it pattern that inflation encourages,
Yep.
deflation rewards long term thinking and saving,
Correct.
which touches on um, the guy you had me listen to talking about using cryptocurrencies as like a digital savings, right? And
Mm-hmm.
maybe that's the whole idea and goal that we should be aiming for, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. Now, some might say that it curbs spending, or that it simply changes the environment and contingencies under which economic agents operate. But
Inflationary
rather than
pressure
a challenge,
distorts your time horizon for satisfaction. Absolutely. Versus short
yeah, for
term. I
sure, no,
mean,
for sure,
because you want to let go of this, your hands start itching because like, man, I got to put this into something, and it's on top of everything else inflation does. It literally like demonizes or not demonizes. It discourages saving. To your point, and I think
yeah,
that
for sure. Yeah, yeah.
it's 100%.
It defeats
I
the
agree
whole
with you.
purpose of things. And I hate having things. You know, you make plans and then the plan gets defeated by some stupid decision you made, and maybe not that you made it. It could be that you were forced to make it. You know, you just
Hmm.
didn't have any choice, or maybe you just had a lapse in logic or reasoning and you just forgot. But
Hmm.
I don't. For me, rather than a challenge, I view this characteristic as emboldening or bolstering economic freedom
Hmm.
because individuals can choose when to spend and when to hold, and without fear that their wealth is being eroded
Yeah.
at the behest of central planners, i.e., the Fed.
Correct.
So when it comes to Bitcoin supply and I say potential deflationary pressures because we can describe it as deflationary, but that might not even be the best way to look at it. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of things about Bitcoin that make me want to say like this is a different animal that requires different words, maybe even words we need to invent to describe its behavior and how it's operating. Like, fine, Bitcoin's a commodity. I definitely see it more as a commodity than I do a fucking security. It's definitely not a security.
Absolutely.
And fine, everything else is a security. Fine.
Who's the
However,
person you're trusting
the,
like in Bitcoin to manage it to where you have a return? Like securities are, it's crazy that it was even deemed a, if, that was even a topic of debate.
I
Like it
mean,
just
it's
showed how
turned into a
far.
commodity. I think in 2015. I mean, that's pretty far back. It's almost like they knew we would get this far. To be honest, makes me still sometimes think it's maybe a government operation. But now, with that said, like now let's say okay, everything else is a security, right? Because it's not Bitcoin, right? Now that can be fair. Even I can consider that fair, especially after all the. I mean, are you familiar with the block wars?
No, no, no.
Don't worry about it. It just there's just been some wars between people and there's been infighting in the Bitcoin community, right? And it let's say that yes, all the altcoins, anything that's not Bitcoin, is essentially a security. Let's leave ADA out of that because ADA is trying their best not to be considered a security. Okay,
Right.
it's fair to call them security. However, it's only fair to call them security because by its definition there's nothing else it can be. And that's not to say that, okay, then it has to be security. That's to say we literally need a new word.
Mm-hmm.
This is like, because it's not even a security. Like we literally, and if these altcoins aren't actually securities and they're actually something else, then the logic's also going to apply to Bitcoin.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Although I'm totally happy with Bitcoin being a commodity. I think that makes sense, especially because it's really a good. It's not just a reflection for some people of um, of inflation of the dollar. It's also a reflection of the value of energy. So, like for example, I forget who made this obvious. It might have been Saylor who made this really obvious to people, but the amount of electricity you're going to use to mine Bitcoin is usually roughly the amount of the value of the Bitcoin you're mining. So to mine a Bitcoin right now, it's going to cost you roughly $100,000 worth of electricity. That's always been true since Bitcoin's inception, at least for the most part. There's some margins here and there, but for the most part, that's been true. It literally seems to be a reflection of energy. So with that said, we really need to reconsider and rethink like how we label and classify these things because like we have commodities, but Bitcoin is something else. Like Bitcoin can't be compared to anything that we call a commodity today. Just like all the altcoins can't be considered like the things we call securities because they're not like the things we call securities. Now, by definition, they can operate, they can be treated like that, I suppose, due to their function and how they're being used, uh, pump and dump schemes, or just almost like they're taking IPOs, kind of like they're a company, and their product or service is the unique utility that the cryptocurrency in question may or may not actually possess. But what I'm trying to say here, my point is that we'll probably need new words for these things. This stuff it's new. It's a new animal. It's a new species. Um, we've never had tech like this, and not just the cryptocurrencies, the blockchain itself. The blockchain, that's essentially an automatic ledger. But what is an automatic ledger? And like I was asking earlier, like what does that mean for society if we can automate a bank? What does that do to society? If like it's possible that it could screw us over. Who knows? That's how unknown this is. We're gonna have to start thinking about things like that. And I don't even think the Bitcoin community or the crypto community in general is really thinking about stuff like that. At least not long and hard enough. I don't see many people discussing that outside of my little circles, anyways. You still there? Oh shit. If you can hear me, Rigel, I cannot hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I've been on mute. I've been talking. I'm
You're
like,
good,
I've been
man.
talking. Oh my god, I'm sorry about that. It's okay. Um, yeah, I had to take my dog in. I had him outside going pee, and he was going crazy. So I had to actually run out because it's 1 in the morning over here. So I missed like the good like last minute of what you said. So I apologize. So
You're good, man. You're good. Don't sweat it. Don't sweat it. Well, you're recording, aren't you?
yeah, I'm recording, so I'll be able to.
All right,
That's
then you'll see what I said.
Yep, exactly. I wanted to end on just like the last question, which we haven't touched on, which I don't see as a threat to Bitcoin whatsoever, but it's all the rage. So CBDCs, right? So
Yeah, for sure.
I'm not going to ask the question. Just go ahead and let me know what you
I
think
mean,
about
so
CBDCs.
I'll just say straight up, like it. So central bank digital currencies,
Mm-hmm.
right? They represent an attempt. I'm going to say attempt by central authorities to reassert control over money in the digital era.
That they
You
notice
know,
they're losing.
and I'm using those words specifically like that because I think it's obvious that crypto in general, especially Bitcoin, has taken hold. It's been adopted enough, the idea has spread enough that the authorities had to come in and rain down on it somehow, in some way. And I say reassert because it's like, they're trying to reassert dominance because they recognize that this thing is probably dominant or going to be dominant or trying to be dominant. And they can't have that. They have to have some sort of control. That's what they want. I'm always going to believe that the control is counterproductive and that Bitcoin is going to operate better without that control all day, every day. But they don't know that, and even if they did know that, they're not gonna just lay down and take it. They're gonna fight, and I see CBCs as them fighting, which is interesting. You will never really see people talk about governments fighting back. No, it's always us fighting them. It's always us fighting their oppression, everything that's unfair with the law system, everything. But with this paradigm we've got here, they have to fight back because they're I wouldn't say they're losing, at least not yet, but it looks like they're losing. They probably see it that way too. Otherwise, they wouldn't need CBDCs, right? And
Man, even Hillary Clinton mentioned how destabilizing, quote unquote, it would be to maybe to the Fed and deficit spending, and but not really in any impactful sense that the common person cares about. So
yeah,
I think to your
well, she
point.
probably doesn't understand cryptocurrency,
Oh,
so
I'm sure she doesn't. But yet,
she's not going to be able to defend or support her side of that claim. But the
but
thing
it's
is
making
that
waves, right? It's making waves to where this is something
look,
she's even like publicly speaking out on, and the lack of
oh
self
yeah, for sure,
awareness,
for
right?
sure.
Like on her part, let's say back years ago, to even give it a platform, right? It only reinforces the reality that it is taking over, and I think that's
Yeah,
I
that
think it's all to
crypto
your
in
point.
general has anyway. It's like, oh, okay,
Absolutely,
crypto won that battle for sure.
right?
Otherwise, they wouldn't have to make their own crypto. But CBDCs, as you know, they can be programmed,
Mm-hmm.
monitored,
Yep.
um, and potentially manipulated well. I don't. I shouldn't even say potentially. It's they can definitely do that. They're the ones who made it. We know who made it. We know how they made it. So yeah, they can absolutely manipulate it at will. Whether or not we think they will is another question. But hey, that just brings us back to the question about trust in banks or trust in government,
Absolutely.
and just the fact that it can be program monitored and manipulated. This contravenes the ideas of individual sovereignty and freedom from external contingencies. And these contingencies have been plaguing us for so our current US dollar, at least 100 or so years, but we've had fiat currency all throughout history, and fiat in all its forms, all throughout history, has always been an external contingency that plagues everyone. And I would consider them fiat regimes, like it's
It's
literally like
very
its
well
own.
said, Alex. Actually, I agree.
That's really probably the best
Yep.
way to put that.
Yep.
And Bitcoin, by remaining independent of political institutions, it serves as a behavioral alternative. So, an environment where individuals can choose to operate outside the sphere of government surveillance, monitoring, engineering, because it very much is engineering, and they're not just engineering our economics; they're trying to engineer our behavior through economics.
Mm-hmm.
And if regulators tighten their grip, Bitcoin's role as censorship resistance, I guess you can say it's censorship resistant, stateless currency only becomes more valuable
Yep.
in that sense. But
Yep.
like, is it really valuable if they have to tighten the grip? And if it's obvious that the only reason what they have is valuable is because they tighten their grip, if that's too obvious, even the public will catch on, and even the public will wonder, well, then why am I doing this? Why am I using this? Why did they even come up with CBDCs? Like, should I consider Bitcoin?
The
So I think everything they do is just gonna reinforce the adoption. And And really, we can credit that to Bitcoin. We can credit that to its algorithm, to its cycles, which like I said, I believe is organic. As long as it keeps doing what it's doing, it won't matter what the government does because it's always going to be more consistent than whatever the hell the government's doing.
Yeah.
In a world moving toward programmable money controlled by central authorities, Bitcoin is the counterweight,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And it's the counterweight that keeps the option of autonomy on the table.
And you know what?
And if you don't have autonomy on the table, then people are going to be pissed because that's the least they want. They want that at the very least. They want autonomy. If there's no autonomy, there's no freedom.
No one's
And
gonna
if
like the
it's
idea of
obvious
surveillance.
enough,
But it's
do
not.
it.
No one likes the idea of surveillance.
What'd
But
you say?
that nobody likes the idea of surveillance. But it's not going to be sold as surveillance. It's going to be sold as secure money,
Yeah,
backed money,
security and,
blah blah
and
blah.
secure by the government who secures your dollar with
Exactly.
petrodollars or
But
whatever.
what
But
they can't
but
stop is
much like the Skinnerian framework, B.F. Skinner, the guy who basically founded what I call radical behaviorism, which eventually produced things like applied behavioral analysts, who are people who use conditioning and we basically use behavioral modification to help people, right? We can do the same thing with Bitcoin is already doing that, right? And let me touch on that so I can explain the Skinnerian framework really quick. ABAs are usually paid by insurance, usually to deal with children and adults with autism. People with autism, they tend to think differently. They can be high functioning, they can be low functioning, they can look and act just like me and you right now, right? And there's two of them. There's an EBA and an ABA. There's an experimental behavioral analyst who formulates experiments and ways to get this person with autism to learn something. It's essentially the science of learning. That's what applied behavioral analysis is. And then there's the applied behavioral analyst who applies the experiment. We want to teach this kid with autism how to tie his shoes. Well, we have to figure out how he thinks first. Unlike me and you, like the standard person, we go to school and we all learn the same way, and some of us will do a little better than others, right? And the autistic kid, he thinks very differently, and what they're doing at school is going to hinder him, and he's not going to learn shit. The job of the EBA is to come up with experiments that the ABA can apply so that this kid, if we can figure out how he thinks, he's not only going to learn, but he's going to learn faster than me and you. That's what ABAs do. This work is only possible thanks to the framework that B.F. Skinner provided us in the 50s. This stuff was not very popular for a long time. You might have heard of ABAs. They're the people who did shock therapy on gay people.
mm-hmm.
Okay,
Okay.
that's them. That's ABA. So they have a bad rap because of that. They don't do that anymore because according to their own research, they should not have been doing that in the first place. Okay? Now, ABAs have come a long way. Radical behaviors have come a long way, right? It had a bad rep, but now it looks like Skinner was right about a lot. He was right a lot about a lot that has to do with behavior and environment, right? So much like the Skinnerian framework, when one environment becomes too controlling, i.e., government, organisms, people, will always seek alternatives to allow for more stable and predictable and self-determined patterns of behavior. I'm sorry I put so much emphasis on that, but free will is very important to me. Human action is all about free will,
Mm-hmm.
although radical behaviorists don't typically believe in free will. And when I say I believe in free will, I don't mean it in the typical sense that most people mean it.
Well,
I
you
don't
probably
even mean it in the way that they define it in human action. For me,
purposeful
free will
behavior.
is do what?
Purposeful behavior.
Sure. Yeah. I like that. My short definition is responsible behavior.
Okay.
Although who the fuck am I to decide what's responsible
In
or
your
not?
own
So that's
mind,
a
and
little
that's the way you see
that's
the
a little
world, bro.
vague. And the ABAs they do have an operational definition for free will, which technically assumes that you don't have it, which is um, to make a choice free of external stimuli or environmental influences. By that definition, you don't have free will because you can't make a choice free from external stimuli or environmental influences.
I,
Um,
I think that then
Now,
what
with that
oh,
said,
sorry.
though, like I said, people will seek alternatives that allow for more stable, predictable, and self-determined behaviors. With that said, Bitcoin, in that context, will always remain the alternative. It'll always preserve that capacity for self-organizing systems of exchange that respect an individual agency. That's just how it's designed. That's just how it works. And there's nothing we can do about that. So we have forks. We can do forks, but that takes a lot of people agreeing. That takes autonomy, and it takes what me and you might call free will. So even if we say um, that it's not fixed, it can be changed through forks. I think it's easy to see that no fork is going to pass without enough consensus. And that's what this is all really about,
Mm-hmm.
consensus, which is just another form of like mass consent. It's a lot of people consenting to a particular idea at the same time and for the same reasons.
Mm-hmm.
There may be some things they disagree, but those things, it's not part of the agreement. That's what makes the consensus so solid.
And
It's
the beauty of it
as,
is,
as, as
irrespective of
objective as
that,
it can be.
the users, it doesn't affect their daily life in terms of how they their cost benefit analysis in terms of how they use, let's say, Bitcoin, or how they have any less or more liberty to use it in whatever capacity they want to. The consensus is rather, should we, for example, add more decimals to Bitcoin because how inflation is going crazy? Let's say we need more decimals
Yeah.
because of,
I think the answer to that is just one Bitcoin is one Bitcoin.
well, of course.
We really need to stop looking at Bitcoin in terms of dollars. That's where a lot of us screw up, and that's what makes us blind to the like. So like when I think of Bitcoin, when I really got into Bitcoin, I had a vision. I still have the vision. I see the vision every day. It's a vision of the future, right? And I could not see that vision until I stopped seeing Bitcoin in dollars. I and it was I remember Satoshi said it, but it wasn't Satoshi I got it from. It was someone on Facebook who made a really long post about why one Bitcoin is one Bitcoin, and it really opened my mind's eye. Like it really helped me see as far in the future as I possibly could, at least with regard to Bitcoin in particular. Until we stop seeing it in terms of dollars, we're never going to see that future we could have. As long as we're thinking in terms of dollars, we're all going to only see the dollar. If you only see the dollar, that means you see the petrodollar. If you see the petrodollar, you see gas. If you see gas and resources, then you see governments. And when you see governments, you see force. And when you see force, you see violence. And that's pretty much how it goes for
Mm-hmm.
me.
Yeah, man. I think that's a very good point. Um, if I were to counter that, I would say, well, at the same time, I kind of like seeing the dollars go up relative to Bitcoin in terms of, or well,
Sure,
well, I
sure,
should I
yeah,
should
yeah,
say I
yeah.
should say down relative to Bitcoin. But yeah, man, wow, dude, it's been really a very cool time, and I really appreciate where you're coming from. I think there's so much common ground. I know what radical behaviorism is now, which I couldn't really say I knew before was, and it's, man. I
Where are
hope we
you in
get to do this again.
Florida?
Me, I am in Central Florida, just right smack
Okay.
dab in the middle, almost literally in the middle of the state, and it's humid and muggy most of the time, but right now it's good. I like the cold. I like taking my boat out in the sunny part of Florida, but
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I love, like, whenever my wife and I travel, we go to Colorado, Alaska. We were just in Seattle a couple weeks ago, and that's like, we just like the mountains and the cold. And maybe it's because we're a product of our environment, and we want something that's cold because we're in a hot, humid environment all the time. So maybe that's
Yeah, 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 yeah,
that's
for
the
sure, for sure. I just
behavioral
went to
side
Colorado
of
for
it.
the first time at the beginning of October, and man, I'm definitely going back. I'm
I,
definitely going
it
back.
was amazing. The Rockies are beautiful. Um, any mountain range with snow and a beautiful sunny day. I've seen many, and I love it every time, and it's always worth it, man. Alex,
Sure. Well, man, it was
oh,
it's a pleasure, dude. I had a really good time.
me too, bro.
Your questions, you have good questions. Really good questions. Those are really important questions. The answers to those questions are really important to me. I wish more people ask questions like that, and I wish more people would see answers to those questions, whether it be my answers or someone else's answers. I don't really care whose answers they are, as long as they can see what answers to those type of questions look like. Um, and I really appreciate you, by the way. You're really great. I'm really glad that you gave me this opportunity to speak my mind. I told you that I didn't really care if this was recorded or not. I really just wanted to talk and
It was fun.
discuss these questions.
Absolutely, man. I thank you for being open to talking. I loved a lot of your answers. I think we have like I told you, man. There's very few things we probably disagree on, and that's true. And not that we have to agree on everything for us to have a conversation.
For sure. No. If we agree on everything, there's a problem with at least.
There's a future spanking video in the works already, so just so you know, I'll be
Okay.
reaching out about that. But besides that, I think we're going to agree on about everything else. And you have very knowledgeable answers, very different perspective from that behavioral side of things that I never saw an intersection for, frankly. So I think that makes a lot of sense. So if we extrapolate from human action, the axiom, the Mises axiom, I think that it makes a lot of sense to tie in behavioral analysis into economics at a more academic, or I don't know if theoretical levels are fair to say. And I'm very interested in exploring that more, man. So thank you for exposing me to that, and yeah, man.
For sure,
I hope
for
to
sure.
do this again, brother.
Next time we can maybe discuss spanking, but also free will. Free will is a big one for me.
Okay.
When we talked about Keynes views and praxeology, I actually have a bone to pick with both, because yes, Keynes sees things as static, like people don't have free will, something like that, and praxeology assumes free will, right? But it's also using a kind of deterministic framework, a causal framework. So I have a bone to pick with both sides of that. I actually disagree with both. I operate from the assumption that we lack free will, but I behave and I have ideals as if we have free will. Kind of like people who say that they act as if God exists but aren't Christians or religious.
Jordan Peterson, maybe.
I think Jordan Peterson does believe in God.
He does, but he still says, "I don't."
Yeah, I know. He always dodges the question. Every time he gets asked the question, I lean forward and I start really listening. I want to know what it is, and every time it's always like, okay, that was a good answer, but it didn't really answer the question.
He tends to overcomplicate things too a little bit, but I do like a lot of his.
I love it, dude. He's super cerebral. He's super cerebral, and I wish I had the intellectual choppers that he had.
Agreed.
The way that he can be, the way that someone can come at him with 4 or 5 different points, and then he can come back with each point in order is phenomenal. I don't have the mind for that. I don't have the brain for that. Dude is phenomenal. Any thinker who does that, I'm always impressed with people like that.
Agreed, bro. Well, man, thank you so much. I'll try to schedule something soon, and hey, man, if you need anything, feel free to reach out. I'm all ears. Yeah, I guess we'll end here. Thank you, everybody. Like, subscribe.
And I'm not far. I'm Panama City. I'm like what, 6, 7, maybe 8 hours at most from you. Maybe sometime we can catch up in person, man.
Absolutely, brother. Absolutely. Guys, thank you so much. Like, subscribe. This is Liberty Forge.